Welcome to the final science meeting for Global Water Futures. I'm Corinne Schuster-Wallace. I'm the Associate Director of Global Water Futures, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Saskatoon for those of you who are here in person. We're on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis, and the University of Saskatchewan is committed to supporting and honoring the Indigenous peoples, Indigenous cultures, Indigenous languages that belong to the land. Water is the lifeblood of people and societies. It connects us. We pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of the Saskatoon region and reaffirm our relationships with one another and with the land and the waters that are so essential to our health and well-being. I invite those of you who are joining virtually from other territories today to reflect on and recognize the lands and the waters that you call home. And please set an intention to have a productive and positive discussion over the next 3 days. Elder Roland Duquette, I'd like to invite you to open the meeting.
Aya pitamaga kioga tamskat na o mo tagapi taguti intaskina inanas kumuyan epi kiutik yogamina epi wanaskik emi asige tueg manaksis poke teo chai sino ka tagutit epi intuskaki goi epi intunak Yogamina epiopahta tan sei sinua gisip matstik tan simini sip mi itihtagus tseka pikskuitsik. Kigwa ei sinu itugoge te tena tuge manasko ka pihtoya. Yogamina kigwa kata siegama tan si mamitunia kuntuni. Muigats kigwa epaseitama maga wawitna kikwe tutama katapahtemua kaikki koi nanto kai spataihia nistana neptan megi te paihu ako semanto kaiti igi ta paihu akekta nistanan kakwi nan to ichitaswa maga matso ni nane mamtonehtama tanse ai sino isip matset tanse mene se kagisemut yogamine kunika kyogi goya tanse se Sawehtseke okse manto kigoy kanto me kakituti tapu. Emi asek tuek mana. Eksiste kanto takay sino. Usami no te pehta kigoy pitus apoitwe agachi asege pehta hegwa mapikskun. Good morning, everyone. Again, I just want to reaffirm my welcoming acknowledgement in my language, my first language, which is the Cree language. It's called Neheo Peekskoon. That's the proper term. And we utilize that in our daily lives as Indian people, as a Neheo. I always emphasize in my home, I have to keep the tradition alive with my wife, my grandkids, my sons. They carry that legacy of a language, of an identity of who we are as people. We're not different, we're just unique. Unique in design, unique in color, unique in how we sound. And we don't differ from anyone because everyone is very unique in each other, because we're not a template as to be one for everyone. We're not designed like that by a creator. That's why we have our own thought process as well. And of course, the choices we make in life as we grow up, as how it was to learn what is the workings of creator that supplies us with our needs, particularly the water. We come from there in a mother's womb. We have that capacity to be in tune with Mother Earth, the land, the water, eh? Aski, Nipi, we call it, eh? Aski is the land and Nipi is the water. So when we talk about the water, we look at our mothers, our grandmothers. They are the ones that are the water carriers, the life givers. Because without water, we would not survive, eh? Everything goes back to creation, eh? What is the first thing that a seed to grow, to wake up, is a drop of water, eh? Amazing, we are the same. When the water hits the seed, it wakes up and turns around. Another drop comes on, and it wakes it up more, and they stretch. And by design, they look up and see where the water is coming from. It's a route. They go up there, that's why we have the grass, everything growing, eh? Now. That's where they come from. Not just automatically, it's a process, eh? It has to have a source of contact, like we do, eh? When we're struggling to have something happening, we all contact each other, our minds together, our souls, our bodies, our thoughts, our experiences, how to develop a way of knowing what is it to survive a water, eh? What is our role? Sometimes we're not heard, but we keep walking, eh? Like a child, it falls, it gets up, eh? It falls, it gets up again till it finds its strength to move by itself, eh? Same with the water. We have to acknowledge it as a human being in that context, eh? Maybe it's hard to understand the comment I made about that, because without water, we will never survive. We will never survive the land. We will never survive the animals. That is why we have to have a structure somewhere where, there's a give and take, eh? Who's going to dam my water? Who's going to put a different way routing my water, what it was helping me in my community? How do I deal with that? We all have that assurance that, if we work together, if we push this thing further than what it is now, awareness globally as we have today, that is our way to acknowledge the safety of our children or the ones that are not born yet. We have to be diligent in our walk, in our way of doing things. And that's why all minds together will create one awareness that's so powerfully. So I greet you all in my territory, Treaty 6 territory, and also the homeland of the Métis. This is where my people traveled. This is where my people walked, this land. Thousands of years and thousands of my people walked. And the bison as well, where they went, where the water source was. They all migrated and we followed, eh? That's how we follow a source, eh? In my time and before that was my people followed the bison, eh? That was a source of livelihood. And where the bison went, they went where the water was. That was their source of survival. So everybody worked together, eh? But now, in my time, we were just about extinct, like the bison were. You need to hear this maybe. That when the residential school system came in place, we were mandated to be eradicated by the one of Prime Minister. They put us in residential schools to humanize us. We were already human beings. We already had our way, governance, survival, everything. We were not without anything. And when the residential school era came, a lot of us died, a lot of us struggled, a lot of us were lost, so we couldn't communicate. Same with the bison. When they got rid of the bison, there were just a few hundred left. Now, the surge of the bison is coming back now as well. And us people were coming back too. It's amazing how survival is very strong. The faith that we have and the hope that's going to happen for all of us. So I greet you all again in my language that I'm Scott now. I'm glad that you're listening. It's a blessed day, we call it. It's a beautiful day. Saskatchewan weather is the best in the world, they say. So I guarantee that today. You go outside and if you doubt me, just enjoy the weather. So that's the guarantee I can give you today is the weather. Wow. I thank you all. Muestas.
Thank you, Elder Duquette, for your words of opening. And I personally, and I hope the rest of you, are willing to commit to diligent and intentional journeys in life as we move forward, and particularly around water. Before we start, I have a few housekeeping remarks to make. And the first is that these sessions are being broadcast on Zoom. So please, if you are using a mic, if you have any questions, if you're coming up to the podium, please use a mic. And I understand that there'll be several that will be floating around for audience questions during the sessions as well. And actually, I can see one stood over on that side of the room. So please remember, we're being recorded, we have people online, and so for them to be able to participate in the same way, appreciate you using the mic system. If you require English closed captioning or support or French interpretation, please, even if you're here in person, join using the Zoom link and you'll be able to access by clicking on the appropriate button, either captioning or interpretation at the bottom of your screen. All presentations and slides need to be uploaded during breaks before the sessions start. So please come here during the break before your session to make sure that either your presentations or your lightning slides are uploaded in advance of the session. And for those of you who are lightning talk presenters, please come up and line up at the beginning of the session at the front. You'll be chaired by Nancy Gauthier and Monica Morrison, and so they will help you and tell you what you need to do. But because you've got 2 minutes and you'll be going through lightning fast, we ask that you're all up at the front ready to go. And finally, for this morning, the buses to Wanuskewin will be leaving immediately after the end of the morning session. So immediately after that Changing Water Budgets, Cryosphere and Rivers session, the buses will be leaving. So please, if you need a bio break, have a bio break, but get yourself down to the buses and on those buses because lunch is waiting for us at Wanuskewin. So the sooner we can get on the buses and get out, the sooner you're sitting down and having lunch and ready to enjoy a fantastic session that we have this afternoon out at Wanuskewin. As I was preparing for this session and for these several days, I was reflecting on the Global Water Futures program. I joined Global Water Futures in 2018, but many of you have been working together for 7 years. And even longer, as the University of Saskatchewan, McMaster University, University of Waterloo, and Wilfrid Laurier University and their partners came together to prepare the Canada First Research Excellence Fund in the first place. So thank you to CFREF and to additional funds from partners and from other research grants Global Water Futures has continued and advanced a really long legacy of water research in Canada. The COVID-19 pandemic interrupted our in-person connections, and so for this reason, I believe that it's even more important for us to take advantage of being here and being able to network over the next few days, catching up with old friends and colleagues and making new ones. We're in a time of increasing frequency and impact of extreme water-related events from coast to coast to coast and around the world. And I'd like to take the time now just to recognize those who are affected by and fighting the wildfires, both here in our province and in Alberta right now. GWF research is so important in helping us to implement strategies and solutions towards more equitable and sustainable management of our water futures. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of the few days and to hearing all of the wonderful research that's been accomplished over the last 7 years by everybody here in the room and on Zoom and elsewhere. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce a few key people who've been involved with Global Water Futures over the years to say a few words of welcome. And first, I'd like to invite Dr. Baljit Singh, Vice President Research here at the University of Saskatchewan, and also the Principal Investigator for Global Water Futures, which is hosted by the Global Institute for Water Security here at the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Singh.
Thank you very much, Corinne. Good morning, everyone. What a pleasure it is to be here on behalf of University of Saskatchewan and President Peter Stoichev to welcome all of you to the final meeting of the final science meeting of the Global Water Futures program. Before I go further into my comments, I really want to acknowledge Elder Duquette and his comments. It always is a pleasure and a moment of learning whenever we are in his presence. My office continues to work with Elder Duquette on many fronts. For example, we meet with him regularly at Livestock and Forage Center of Excellence, where we keep the bison. And we really sit down with him every few weeks to go over the connection between the land, the animals, the humans, and water, and everything in between. It's quite a different way to look at how we are connected to each other. So again, I'm deeply grateful to Elder Duquette that he takes time to help us get to a better place in a good way. The program that you have all been part of has been a national collaboration which had more than 20 universities, but I really want to acknowledge the contribution made by 4 universities that form the oversight committee of the program. Dr. Karen Mossman from McMaster, Dr. Charmaine Dean from Waterloo, and Dr. Jonathan Newman from Wilfrid Laurier, along with me, constituted the oversight committee. Before that, Dr. Karen Chad, who was the thought leader and the major proponent of this application, she is the one who passed over the baton to me 2 years ago. And Dr. Howard Wheater, we will hear from him in a moment. His work as Canada Excellence Research Chair and the inaugural director of the Global Institute for Water Security really was foundational into where we are today in this country when it comes to freshwater research. Leadership by many, including Dr. Corinne Schuster-Wallace, Dr. John Pomeroy, and many others in the room, has been incredible in creating this powerhouse of a science program in the country. When we think about water, the purpose of creating Canada First Excellence Research program really comes into focus. The idea was to create solutions to very complex problems through cutting-edge science and also decision-making tools that take us into social sciences and policy and community engagement. This particular program has done exactly that. If you look at the output of the GWF, there have been nearly 2,000 peer-reviewed papers published. I want you to take a moment here that this program has been in operation for about 320 weeks. That's about 6 peer-reviewed papers every week. Just think about that for a moment. And about 10 or 12 presentations to the media every week. And nearly 2,000 researchers brought into the program, as they will continue to develop the water research in this country and around the globe. The legacy piece is there, but you think about the productivity of the team that has constituted the Global Water Futures program. It's amazing. And when you look at the policy side of the story, the development of Canada Water Agency in this country was again argued for by the Global Water Futures program, along with many others coast to coast. And here we are with the CWA, which is being established in this country. If you look at the intersectionality of the science and the policy and the arts, the exhibit out there is again an indicative of the work that we can do together when we break down the silos in which quite often we exist. This program has done exactly that. It has not broken down the silos. Silos are good sometimes. We have to grow disciplinary excellence by way of building really outstanding silos. But the way is, how do we create connections between the silos? How do we create glass windows and the pipes so that the silos get connected to each other? Because if we disrupt all the silos, we will be in a mishmash type of situation. So we need to pay attention as to what the balance is between the two. When we look at the data collection, creation of the equipment, stations, and the observatories around the country to collect the data, to feed into our decision making, that is another legacy of the program. As the program wraps up, GWF wraps up, we have major science initiative funding that will allow us to maintain these facilities up to 2029, which means that we will be able to continue to have the gathering of scholars around those facilities to take the data and continue to advance thinking on the fresh water, cold waters in this country and around the globe. Thinking about the globe, I really want to take it a little bit further. Seeing our leaders from this program at United Nations last month was quite an eye-opener. The type of science which the world needs is coming from this group, along with many others around the globe. And that's why at University of Saskatchewan, we think that we will aspire to be the university the world needs. We are not the university the world needs, but we really want to be a contributor to do everything, produce everything that the world needs. The land where I grew up in an agricultural rural setting, we could drill a tube well and hit water at about 15 feet in 1980. 40 years later, we are at 300 feet. Just put it in perspective, 1.2 billion people in a country like India, we have to produce food, create infrastructure for people to live in cities and urban settings, and we are into that dire strait when it comes to the water security. I'm sure you could pick up similar examples from around the globe, and that again puts into perspective as to what are we going to do with the fresh water, recharging of the aquifer, and how are we going to support humanity so that we can keep on doing creative work instead of getting into global fights and the wars over water. Every jurisdiction around the globe has a flashpoint over a river, over a lake, over the rainfall, over a mountain, and it all goes down to water. Therefore, the work of this group and thousands of grad students, postdocs who have gone through the program is really just beginning. We may have scratched the surface when it comes to the solution, but we are nowhere closer to where we can be confident that we will have adequate water supply for the humanity to do what it needs to do for the centuries to come. And that's where what Elder Duquette has called upon us to do is that, yes, we are not similar to each other. We are not imprint of each other. That's where the creativity of individuals, where their unique way of thinking comes into play. And that's what this program has done to bring to the fore. When Canada created Canada First Excellence Research Program many years ago, the purpose was to put the Canadian science at the forefront of the global race for scientific solutions to complex problems. And if there is one example I can cite that has done exactly that, it is the Global Water Futures Program. Therefore, I'm grateful to all the work you have done. I'm so proud of to be associated with the program. Thank you so very much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Dr. Singh, and also to the Oversight Committee for your leadership. We really appreciate it. And now I have a few words from Dr. Christian Schoenard, who is the Director of the Canada First Research Excellence Fund, the Canada Excellence Research Chairs, and the Canada 150 Chairs programs. And Dr. Schoenard's joining us online.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes, okay, thank you. So thank you, thanks again, Corinne. Again, I'm Christian Chouinard, Director of the Canada First Research Excellence Fund Program, CFREF, Canada Excellence Research Chairs Program, and Canada 150 Chairs Program at the Tri-Agency Institutional Program Secretariat, or TIPS for short. I'm delighted to be here today to witness the great successes and impact of the Global Water Futures CFREF initiative. CFREF aims to boost the strength of Canadian post-secondary institutions so that they can achieve global success in research areas that create long-term social and economic advantage for Canada. CFREF invests approximately $200 million per year through a highly competitive peer review process to support the Canadian post-secondary institutions in turning their key strengths into world-leading capabilities. The objectives are to support the full range of research from fundamental to applied, and to give institutions the ability to pursue the best in the world for talent and partnership opportunities to enable breakthrough discoveries, seize emerging opportunities and strategically advance their greatest strengths on the global stage, and implement large-scale transformational and forward-thinking institutional strategies. GWF was one of the 18 CFREF grants awarded in the inaugural competitions 7 years ago, which had a total competition budget envelope of $1.2 billion. It's noteworthy to highlight that from that total, at least $330 million was dedicated to the support of students and postdoctoral fellows. The sheer breadth of interdisciplinary research conducted through initiatives such as GWF is truly astonishing. Last fall, the federal government asked us to provide examples of impacts generated by the CFREF initiative. Here's an excerpt of what was sent to them for GWF. The Global Water Futures program has become the largest and most published university-led freshwater research program in the world. Global Water Futures has developed the first national water forecasting and prediction models for Canada. Along with this, GWF is predicting future freshwater availability and quality, including floods and droughts across Canada and the world. GWF works with hundreds of partners, including Indigenous communities and governments, to co-develop solutions for the impact of climate change and development at all scales. Needless to say, government was extremely impressed by the impacts generated by the investments in GWF, as well as the other CFREF initiatives. The new 2022 CFREF competition results were just announced by Minister Champagne a few weeks ago in Montreal. And this time, 11 institutions will share $1.4 billion to bring Canada's best elements together and work on interdisciplinary projects that will generate positive outcomes and impacts for all Canadians. Again, an important proportion of this funding will go towards supporting students and postdocs, who are the leaders of today and tomorrow, and who continue to push the envelope and stretch the limit of our imagination to generate research outcomes that have positive impacts for all. The University of Saskatchewan will once again be represented in the CFREF landscape as a partner institution with a major role to play in the leadership of an important health-related CFREF led by the University of Ottawa. You may visit the CFREF program website to learn about the 11 new CFREF initiatives that will contribute to the social and economic benefit of all Canadians. To conclude, thank you all for everything that you accomplished and will keep accomplishing through the GWF CFRF initiative. And best of luck in your future endeavors. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Chouinard, and thank you on behalf of the Government of Canada for such an innovative funding mechanism to allow us to bring all of the sciences and scholarly artistic work together in projects such as Global Water Futures. And now, on behalf of the Global Water Futures Indigenous Engagement Committee, I would like to invite Dr. Dawn Martin-Hill from McMaster University and Mr. Anthony Blair Dreva-Johnston from Mr. Wasis Nehewak to come up and say a few words.
Good morning. Welcome to my territory. Welcome to the lands of my ancestors. Welcome to the gathering place of the ancient ones. Thank you, Roland, for opening us in a good way, starting us in a good way. Like Roland, I am of the Mr. Wasis Nehewak. I am from the place, Mr. Wasis, and I am from the person, Mr. Wasis. Mr. Wasis Nehewak has been part of Global Water Futures at the proposal stage, and we're still with you. Through the Prairie Water Project, Mr. Wasis, my community, my people have benefited from 3 research projects. A number of weeks ago, April 12th to 14th, other Indigenous communities, other First Nations came and gathered on the shoreline of one of the beautiful lakes of Mr. Wasis. Later this afternoon at Wanuskewin, another gathering place of my ancestors, the ancient ones, we will share a statement with you. We will have messages for you. We will have messages for Global Water Futures. We will have messages for a shared good future. Thank you.
Now, Anthony, and thank you for having me both visit your community and the land here. Thank you, Global Water Futures, for the work you have tried to do and continue to do with First Nations people and scientists. As a member of the committee, we worked really hard to try to engage Indigenous ways of knowing and knowledge in a society that has literally not been exposed to that for most of their likely academic careers. So it's a tough mountain we're climbing together. And as Indigenous people who do have PhDs or who are in the system, we kind of have to be the translators. We have to try to write grants that both meet the metrics of excellence of science, but also are committed to the authenticity of our Indigenous ways of knowing. That is a challenge. We often do not get funded because there are not enough reviewers who understand or have expertise in our ways of knowing. So I do a lot of committee work. I sit on a lot of those reviewing grants because we want Indigenous knowledge to be supported. It's unfair to most of us that many of you, including myself, have never taken a Native Studies course. I created Indigenous Studies as a student. I had to develop the courses with elders. I had to find the instructors, and that's what I was doing the first 10 years of my academic career, creating spaces and transforming spaces. So the luxury of doing research to apply in real world issues that our elders have long cared about is is to me a privilege. I'm 60. I'm finally able to do what I wanted to do when I was 25. So that's what privilege is. It's having to be able to follow your pursuits of your interests. But in our terms, we haven't been able to do that because we were busy servicing Western institutions to create spaces for ourselves. So we're really happy with what GWF has done. At least they responded to my first moment as a PI and somewhat criticisms that there wasn't more Indigenous content or PIs in that room, and they followed up immediately. They acted immediately, and they engaged immediately. And I had to sit on that committee to make sure that I backed up what I was wanting to see, which is more traditional ecological knowledge funded. And that is what the doors that have opened for us collectively and elevated our work globally, whether at the UN, whether in the States or in New Zealand. I don't think it can be measured properly. But we have tried to work with engineers and biologists 20 years ago. That's what our elders wanted. They could not understand us. It just couldn't happen. We were talking past each other. So the work that GWF did to create the space for this dialogue, I think, is one of the most important legacies that GWF has put us in a room that we were never in before. And now that we're here, I encourage everybody to continue because I truly believe in the science and the data, back it up. We need to work together. We need to figure out how to work together, but there needs to be equity in knowledge. There needs to be a shared equity because what our elders know is just as valuable and important as the graduate student or the postdoc, but they're not funded. There's no funding to support the knowledge of our young people who are trying to learn. So we need to fix some things, and I'm hoping that part of the work that Anthony is doing and that Roland is doing, and Mary, a clan mother from Six Nations, we're all trying to make sure that this isn't lost, that this work, important work, continues, and we depend on all of you to make sure it thrives in your universities, in your institutions, to continue this very, very important work, because, our house is on fire. It's time just to work together and find solutions. And again, my prayers and thoughts are with the community I worked with for 30 years, the Lubicon in Northern Alberta. They're having a hard time. So we really need to work together quickly, and I hope that Canada Tri-Council supports more of this type of research. Nyawe, thank you, Danito.
Today, I wore my buffalo shirt for you. In a herd of buffalo, in a herd of plains bison, the women lead.
Thank you, Dawn and Anthony, and thank you to all of the members of the Indigenous Engagement Committee and to everybody who travelled from almost all parts of Canada a few weeks ago to join and participate in the water gathering, which is where the statement that Anthony talked about was developed, and as he said, it will be shared with everybody here this afternoon at Wanaskewin. And now, also joining us virtually is Dr. Howard Wheater, the former director of Global Water Futures, who led the proposal development during his tenure as the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Water Security here at the University of Saskatchewan. Howard, please.
Thank you very much, Corinne. Do you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you, even if remotely, and also to tell you that you got there 7 years on. I came to Canada in 2010, and at that time, I think it was clear that the world was facing a major water crisis. increasing populations, increasing demand for water, pressures on aquatic systems in terms of pollution, particularly nutrients, severe pressures on our aquatic ecosystems with loss of habitats, a whole series of challenges. And the writing was really on the wall as far as water research is concerned, because it was clear that we needed to bring people together across disciplines to tackle these very complex and multifaceted challenges. But also we needed to do a much better job in engaging with the user community, the people that were raising these questions, needing the answers and needing tools to move forward. And with a tribute to the Canadian government, then I came to Canada as the Canada Excellence Research Chair, and that gave the university $40 million of funding, and that allowed us to set up the Global Institute for Water Security, and indeed to bring people together really for the first time across the Saskatchewan campus. So I'd like to pay tribute to the Canadian government in that respect, but then moving on from that, then as we just heard from Christian, 2015, we had this amazing opportunity to really think big and address these existential challenges that Canada is facing. Canada, of course, is really at the forefront of environmental change due to global warming, but also it contains all the pressures that we see around the world on water quantity, water quality, extremes of floods and droughts, habitat degradation, and so on. So in 2015, a small group of us got together to really respond to this challenge that the Canadian government had laid down with its CFREF program. And there was a small group of people from a small number of universities recognizing the challenge, but recognizing the skill sets and the opportunities that we had in Canada, building on the observational networks that have been created over the years and decades, but also building on the expertise that exists right the way across Canada. So we came up with this proposal, which, as we know, was successful. It was really to develop a new paradigm for research, moving really from the old regime which we had 20 years ago, where scientists did their work, wrote papers, and assumed that people would read them and assimilate that information. We now know that's a recipe for failure, and we, as the science community, need to do very much more to engage with the users of the knowledge that we seek to acquire. We talked about the challenges for Canada, the need to really understand the nature of change, and that took us along the route of developing observatories, pan-Canadian observatories, developing new sensors, new remote sensing tools and techniques. It took us down the route of better tools to support management decisions and to help us get some handle on the way in which water futures were changing and the way in which management was changing. And then I think we managed to do something unique in really uniting Canada from west to east to provide a united front to tackle these challenges. And as you know, we were successful. The program started. We have the 4 universities that put their hands in their pockets to a substantial amount to augment the CFREF funding. And that, in particular, allowed us to appoint a raft of new talent to the faculties of those institutions. And I can see one of those standing by the microphone in front of me, Karin. So we brought together the Canadian community. We involved 23 Canadian universities. As a program, you've had major international impact. So leading initiatives for UNESCO, the World Meteorological Organization, and right now spearheading the group that's transforming the way in which the United States is modeled in real time. And then we made these really important steps in engaging with communities. I have to say, I very much enjoyed my own interactions with First Nations in Canada, particularly the work that we were doing with our friends in the Saskatchewan Delta. But then with the assistance and support of Dawn in reaching out, I think very successfully, as we've heard, to a wider community of First Nations across Canada. Baji talked a little bit about the training, and apart from the new faculty, we've trained 1,000 or so students, 500 or so research staff, and these really are the people that are going to manage the future moving forward. So I think GWF can be particularly proud of its heritage in training the next generation of researchers. So in the last year or so, we've seen an amazing emergence of water as a really global threat that nobody can deny. We've seen a third of Pakistan going underwater. We've seen floods in eastern Australia. We've seen really severe flooding in New Zealand. We've seen drought in East Africa. Europe's had the worst drought in 500 years, shutting down its power stations for lack of cooling water, shutting down its transport systems because there wasn't enough water in the rivers to move goods around the country, and all the implications, of course, for crop yields and so on. So we're living in a world of unprecedented water challenge, and Canada has all of these challenges and particularly has to cope with this rapidly warming environment. So I've been looking at the documents that GWF has produced. The output is truly remarkable. I think a key challenge for you all as we move into the final stages is to synthesize that in a way that brings forward useful information with clarity and brevity. That's a real challenge, given the diversity of the 65 projects that the regional task forces have been created and have produced so much to increase our knowledge of the different areas of Canada and to produce the tools needed to look forward. So, in summary, the Canadian government gave us an absolutely unique opportunity. I'm extremely proud of the way you guys have taken this opportunity and run with it. Global Water Futures is really transformative for Canada. It's shown the way for the world. And I was very proud to have played a small part in helping to take this forward. And thank you for your invitation to join today.
Thank you ever so much, Howard. Thank you for your leadership and your vision in establishing the Global Institute for Water Security. And thank you for your challenge, and from Dawn and Anthony as well, in terms of, Global Water Futures has achieved its 7-year milestone, but that does not mean that any of us can stop. And so now, from the former director to the current director of Global Water Futures, Dr. John Pomeroy.
Good morning. So, we got through the pandemic, and the Welsh have a saying for this, Imao hyd, which is we are still here. And I think many of us can relate to that in many ways. But it's wonderful to be back together in our meeting in person and to talk to Global Water Futures at 7. And this meeting will be a marvelous chance to review the accomplishments of all of you in working tirelessly towards the research that we collect in this program. So I'll go back and talk a bit about how we started and where we're heading. And one good thing to start is to go back to the previous network. And this was the Changing Cold Regions Network funded by NSERC, led by Professor Wheater, and it produced the synthesis at the end. And this is from a paper led by Chris de Beer and many, many, many authors, pulling together everything that occurred in that network and painting a picture of Western Canada's future in the late 21st century. And if you look at the newspaper or news headlines today, you might see a few of these things, unfortunately. Wildfires, glacier retreat, grassland expansion in many areas, new crops being tried, floods in many regions, changing and earlier stream flows, and then further north, permafrost thaw, occasional rain on snow flooding and others. So these are from expectations and science-based understanding of what the late 21st century will be, but we're seeing harbingers of this showing up now in many ways. When we start looking at how Canada's water has fared in this century, since the year 2000, I think one inevitably must conclude that we're in a water crisis along with the rest of the world. Even though we have 20% of the world's freshwater storage, we have water problems, and we keep adding to this figure. Well, it's already out of date given the events this spring of wildfires in the west and floods in the north and floods in eastern Canada. But you can go through and pick your area of the country and find your own disaster through there. And the costs have skyrocketed to Canada. Of course, we're warming 2.5 times faster than the rest of the world in southern Canada, 3.5 times faster in northern Canada, and our projected warming and wetting will be substantial moving into the future. And we're starting to see some of these extremes, but some of these are our own goals in a sense that we've not always managed our water as well as we could. We've not always applied the solutions that were possible that we could do. And this is where Global Water Futures comes in. And we simply have to deal with these major issues and solve them. One group, the Aquanomics report, estimated last year that the future costs of waterborne disasters in Canada will be $128 billion by 2050. And that's just droughts, floods, and storms, flooding. That's not including fires and other effects and water quality effects. And our neighbors to the south and our largest trading partner, $4.5 trillion over the same period. And so the world is going to be changing quickly. And other countries that we have strong relationships with of various types will be also put in very, very different situations, which will affect our economy, will affect immigration, will affect our ability to prosper and thrive as a equitable and just society here. And one thing that comes through very strongly from all this is that water management needs to provide the solutions, that we have a chance through water to solve some of the major impacts of climate change and land use and land cover changes that are occurring. And in fact, humans have done this since the dawn of our history. We are water managers. And so we, using science and better knowledge and more equitable approaches, perhaps can manage our water better in the future and alleviate some of the problems that we might have and that we do have. So, as Howard mentioned, in 2016, the Global Water Futures program was funded by the Canada First Research Excellence Fund with a substantial grant. It was the largest in the University of Saskatchewan's history, and in fact, the largest single water grant in the world's history. And so with our partners from Waterloo, McMaster, Wilfrid Laurier University, and individual collaborators from many more universities across Canada, you'll see listed there, we developed the program. It was, Howard's very modest about the amount of work it was. His leadership was crucial, and it was a tremendous amount of work, starting early in 2015, maybe even over Christmas 2014, to develop the program and start to move it forward. And my spouse, Marilyn, took a photograph of me when I had a phone call on an infamous day, August 3rd, 2016. And it was Karen Chad phoning, saying, "We got it. and pretty excited. And I don't know if you can read my expression there. No one at the time could read my expression. It was a mixture of, wow, we got it, and a mixture of, oh my gosh, how are we going to do this? And so it was a delight and horror at the same time. And but I think that's turned to pure delight as we have done it. And then the emails with Howard, I emailed, oh my, and he wrote back, indeed. So anyway, I think it was a shared thing. But here we are, and so we have aims at the beginning to place Canada as a global leader in water science in cold regions, and I think we've very much done that. And then also to address the strategic needs of the Canadian economy in adapting to change and managing the risks of uncertain water futures. And we worked very hard to do that, and I think made great progress in that area. The Global Water Futures mission, and you'll see art here, and this art is from Gennady Ivanov, our artist in residence. You'll see his art and Gennady in person with the art exhibit in the next room and tonight. But our mission was to improve our capacity for water-related disaster warning, to diagnose and predict water futures and impacts on society and ecosystems, and to develop the new models and tools and approaches that we need to manage water-related risks, to adapt to change and to help our users manage their risks. And so the program has grown and grown and grown, and from an original 12 projects and 6 core teams that we established right away after months of user engagement and working up the user needs list, we've now grown to 65 projects and core teams, so roughly 59 projects in there. From the original $77.8 million award, we've been able to leverage funds up to over $300 million and more added to this. This snapshot here is based on measurements conducted to the end of March of last year. So we've moved forward another year from this. So when you look at the number of universities, investigators, partners, and students, they've grown, and the publications are growing astronomically, as Baljit indicated. So we're well over the 2,000 publications, we're well over 500 partners, 23 universities involved now, and over 213 professors funded at those universities. A network of research observatories and labs across the country, and over 2,000 students and researchers and technicians and postdocs and others are hired and trained under the program. And so we contribute internationally in many ways, and more directly now to the United Nations as it develops its water program, and are having influence strongly felt in Canada and internationally. We developed the program originally around 3 pillars. And so one was to sort of underpinning the others, and that was developing the big data and the decision support systems that would allow users to move forward and make decisions and to see what that future might be. A science pillar underpinning all of this in a sense. One, diagnosing and predicting change, and then the one where sort of the rubber hits the road, the designing user solutions, and this is working with our enormous user community to co-develop projects and co-develop solutions that are suitable for them, for their communities, for their economies, for their industries, whatever that might be, for their region. And this has been a very successful approach because they work together, and this is something we call transdisciplinarity. And so supported by a user advisory committee, by an Indigenous advisory committee, checked on the outside by an international science advisory committee, managed internally through the strategic management committee. Many of these were people who wrote and worked on the original proposal and have been working hard for more than 7 years on this program, and then overseen by the oversight committee of vice president's research of the 4 partner universities behind it. But it's been a very good model. And our core teams have been central to this. These are large teams. The modeling team, over 40 people in there, and a large number of faculty as well working on this. But so they work together. So we have the observatories. We have about 64 depending how you count them across the country. Many technicians taking the measurements we have, supporting the students and the researchers in there to generate that basic science that supports the models over 7 major river basins and more, as you'll see. And this information coming to user engagement and data information systems such as GWF Net and our very, very active knowledge mobilization and communications teams through here. And all this supported and underpinned by our computer science team to make sure that we have the most up-to-date, innovative software to do these types of things. So the program has been, I think, very beneficial to Canadians. We've mentioned ability to, at a national scale, predict floods, droughts, and water quality episodes, contribute to floodplain mapping and risk calculations associated with water-based disasters, help understand the impacts of irrigation, beneficial management factors, practices, and precision farming, respond to climate change and extreme events, provide the foundation for federal and provincial water management strategies, and bringing Indigenous communities and peoples to the table at water management in a way that hasn't occurred in Canada before. Restoration of our lakes and water information to support our economy and our prosperity, whether it be economic or intellectual or emotional or recreational. And attract and retain talented young professionals and thought leaders. Get them to Canada, keep them in Canada. And so many people here have come here during the program. It's been just marvelous to see that and to see them come to our universities and really become star researchers on their own right. And that's wonderful. So quickly, what have we accomplished? Well, we'll find out at this meeting, but here's a high-level overview. We are the largest, we're the most published, and one of the most cited university-based freshwater research programs in the world. We have featured at the UN Water Conference in March of this year with the Secretary General and other events. We have a UN Year of Glacier Preservation that was passed by the UN General Assembly. So we're driving these things forward, and through links through UNESCO and WMO, that's happening very much, as well as bilateral relationships with many, many countries. We've learned how to co-develop knowledge and capacities with Indigenous, municipal, industries, provinces, the federal government, and international organizations. And we have implemented something we're very proud of, a co-developed Indigenous community water research strategy to co-create new knowledge with Indigenous communities. And you can see a photograph from the meeting at Wanuskewin in April 2018, where we worked together to develop that strategy and develop the call for proposals that resulted in the 6 Indigenous co-led projects, which I believe were novel at the time, but not now, and that's a success as well. What else have we accomplished? We've engaged with the federal and provincial governments to develop a national flood forecasting capability, the first national streamflow forecasting workshop in Vancouver, BC. You see Al Petronero leading that there. That was a game changer for Canada. The provincial forecasters had not met each other in many cases at that time. New code and computer technologies for state-of-the-art water prediction systems. And as you'll see at this meeting, combining science and art to communicate the challenges of water security during climate change. The virtual water gallery is incredible. What else have we accomplished? We have diagnosed changing water futures due to climate and ecosystem change and water resources management. A whole host of models. I won't rattle off the acronyms, but you'll see them in the posters and in the talks, and the model agnostic framework to bring them all together very quickly and efficiently. So we ended up modeling not just the 7 major river basins of southern Canada, but all of North America, and in fact, in some models over the whole world. We've worked with over 500 users to develop the solutions with them and for them to help them manage the water-related risks in a variety of situations across the country. And we've had strong impact and information for provincial and national policies and practices. Just noted the flooding occurring in Yukon right now, and Dawson City is being predicted by the mesh model provided to the Yukon government and helping them inform their flood forecasting. And they had a very successful evacuation of the Klondike Valley in Dawson City with some of the largest floods in a century just over the last few days, aided perhaps in some way by those model results. There's also the COVID detection, the pivot of the eDNA project to move from invasive species in our freshwaters to invasive species in humans. And that was the ability to measure COVID concentrations in sewage in our communities developed by Global Water Futures researchers has been incredible, because as we have lost the monitoring from provincial governments as the way to understand the pandemic, we had the COVID measurements to look at uptakes and community-based health indicators as whether it was on upswing or downstream, and it turned out to be some of the best data available. And training the generations of young professionals. You'll hear more from them, and you'll see their posters today, and you'll see many of them volunteering in yellow shirts, and it's greatly appreciated. But over 1,800 people trained in the program. We have worked tirelessly advising the federal government of the benefits that might accrue in forming a national water agency to collect the national capacity around water into one shop, one window, called the Canada Water Agency. And the federal government committed to developing this and standing it up this year with a headquarters in Winnipeg, Manitoba. So congratulations to Winnipeg, and congratulations to the federal government for doing something that very, very right and very timely and very needed. And that came through clearly from our users and from the many consultations that we held about what that agency might do. We've also worked to develop an ambitious intersectional strategy for equity, diversity, and inclusion of water research. And you'll see the field guide for EDI in the field as the newest report from that. Andrea Rowe and Corinne working on this, and the EDI reports and strategies for GWF, which I think are class leading, and helping our universities move forward on that. So this will be a long-term legacy of this, notwithstanding the Women Plus Water seminar series, which has been superb and incredibly popular around the world. Global Water Futures is a regional hydroclimate project for the GWEX, Global Energy and Water Exchanges project of the World Climate Research Program, and is the only North American regional hydroclimate project. It's very important. Of course, many of our basins are binational and extend to the United States. We've also been a model for the development of the Andex project in South America, and helped advise the development of that. We're working with GWEX on Central Asia, a Central Asia experiment moving forward, and we have the International Network for Alpine Research Catchment Hydrology as a GWEX crosscut project of mountain research basins for around the world. But we're helping to address the prediction aspects, the interrelationships between the atmosphere and water, and the human influence on the water cycle components of GWEX's science goals and the grand challenge of water for food baskets of the world. And of course, we have very strong contributions on the big lakes and the cold regions and the transboundary aspects of this. So we're seen very positively in the GWEX and World Climate Research Program. The young professionals, they bring together researchers, grad students, technicians, postdoctoral fellows, anyone who feels young, I think, in a sense, but to provide a sense of community, provide resources for mentoring so they can have their own meetings, but have their own seminars and webinars and other things, enable collaborations and networking, and professional development courses. And that's been a very active component of it, and of course, that is the future. And so that's why we invest in it. Our knowledge mobilization team is an absolute gem, and has produced stunning materials since the beginning of the program. And recent ones are the story sprints and research impact profiles. You'll see on a desk out there the briefing book, it's sort of the start of the summary of Global Water Futures from each of the projects, our science features, the science and art, the media and communications. And so the communications team, our outreach coordinator, Stacy, and others work together on this to make sure we're extremely active in knowledge mobilization, as we should be. So what's coming? Well, the program is not ending this year. We have a 2-year unfunded extension from the CFRF, which is good news, and because it allows many of our projects that were delayed by the pandemic to wrap up their work over the next year, and we hope to see them all wrapped up by the end of the summer in 2024. But some projects are wrapping up right now, so they're in different stages at this point. But it gives us time to sit back, reflect, and then get to work synthesizing this into useful products that bring our knowledge together. And as you see right now, we've got this vast elephant and we all feel a bit blind and we can grab a tail or a foot or something and we're not quite sure what it is. But I'm hoping by the end of this meeting, we'll begin to see what that elephant looks like. And then after 2 years, that we'll have a very beautiful, detailed description of it that is very helpful for this country and others as they move forward to deal with water. And so this is the GWF synthesis. And the plan is that we would have a national synthesis results, much as we did for CCRN, but on a larger scale, aided by assessment drawing from federal government assessments, and there are new ones coming, couching it in a bit of an assessment that we can do ourselves. This is something that will be led by the Strategic Management Committee. We'll develop a national report and regional and summary reports, and the Indigenous projects will develop an Indigenous report. So I'll show you a little bit more about that, what that might mean. So a national report would be having thematic chapters and things like climate and extremes, groundwater, lakes, ponds, human dimensions, international waters. You'll see the organization of this meeting corresponds very much to the structure of that national report that we envision. And with cross-country issues for all chapters that we want to deal with that you'll see down there. So that would be a very important thing, published in parts in various high-impact journals, but also put together as a single report. So groups like the Canada Water Agency, the provincial governments, have something that a bit of a foundational document moving forward and a great legacy for Global Water Futures. Regional reports will be a bit more user-oriented in this sense because now we're getting down to individual river basins and provincial governments. And so we'll have one for the Eastern and Central Canada, one for Western Canada, one for Northern Canada, and they'll be structured for a bit more of a regional synthesis and looking at future priorities in those regions. We'll also distill these down to 4 pages to 2 pages to 1-page documents that can be influential perhaps in guiding policy and development. The Indigenous report will be in parallel to the other activities and led by the Indigenous Engagement Committee and very much based upon the GWF co-led projects and other projects that have substantial Indigenous engagement. So for this meeting, what do we hope for? Well, I already have seen people reconnecting, and that's wonderful. We want you to build new and stronger collaborations. We'll initiate the GWF synthesis through this meeting and develop our big picture of the elephant, of what our accomplishments are. And we have funding coming from the Canada Foundation for Innovation for a just over $40 million project called the Global Water Futures Observatories. And that will keep our network of observations and data management going, along with a little bit of outreach and knowledge mobilization and project management, that we can build the foundation for the next big thing. And so we can launch that here as well. I'll just leave this up, but here's the overview for today. We've got our break right now. We have a 1:15 to come back for the sessions starting up. 1 p.m.'s lunch. And of course off to the buses before then, so we can have that at Wanuskewin. 5:30 p.m. receptions tonight. The virtual water gallery open to the public at 7 p.m. And then we carry on the next days. We have Terry Duguid, Member of Parliament and Parliamentary Secretary for Environment and Climate Change Canada, to the Minister, speaking at lunch tomorrow. And we have Tom Pham Vang, from the Vice President of the Water Security Agency in Moose Jaw, speaking for our banquet tomorrow night. So lots of wonderful things and a field trip for the young professionals at the end. So thank you and enjoy it.
Thank you to John and to all of our welcoming note speakers this morning. A few last remarks. Again, those of you presenting in the next session, please, during the break, come up here and as panelists or lightning talk speakers, put your presentations, put them on a USB and bring them up so they can be uploaded onto the computers to save us time during the actual events. And at the end of the morning sessions, please, short bio break if you need to, and then straight to the buses. And finally, it was mentioned by John, but it's my great pleasure to formally launch the hashtag GWF EDI, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion in Field Research Protocol. And so building on our EDI strategy, it represents a next step in our commitment to making water research and research networks more equitable, more diverse, more inclusive, and more accessible. So there are 3 copies on the table by the registration table, and Andrea and I will be there during the break. So if you have any questions or if you want to have a quick look at it and talk to us about it, then we'll be there. So thank you, enjoy your break, back here as John said. Okay, thank you.
So, bonjour tout le monde, good morning. So we're going to start the first session that is about changing climate and extremes. So I will introduce myself. My name is Julie Thériault, and I'm a professor at the Université du Québec à Montréal in atmospheric science. And I've been involved in GWF since the beginning. So today I will be chairing this session, and we have a few presentations that would follow mine. So this is the outline of the session today, as it's written on the program as well. So I'll be giving a 20-minute overview of what has been done in climate and extremes in GWF. Then Chandra Rajulapati will talk about one of the projects, but also her experience in GWF as she transitioned from an HQP to a faculty member. And then one of the main climate modeling outcomes from GWF is the CONUS-2 simulations. So Zhenhua Li will be presenting those results and also showing you how to access the data. And then many projects, in particular the Pillar 3 projects, were user-driven projects. So Manitoba Hydro representative Scott Herbert and Kevin Sagan are here today to give perspectives on extremes from Manitoba Hydro, and then we'll have an open discussion. So today I'll be presenting what we have done about climate change, changing climate, and extremes. And we aim to improve the understanding on how climate change influences water availability and extreme events, knowledge foundational for understanding subsequent impacts on climate change and water. So these were done through 6 projects that were funded through GWF. 2 of them are user-driven projects, so the foundation, which are Pillar 3 projects, climate-related precipitation extremes, and Mountain Water Futures, the mountain climate extremes part. Then to complete those projects, 4 Pillar 1s and 2 were funded. And so we'll hear from Chandra about the first one, the paradigm shift in downscaling climate model projection. And there's 3 other projects that I will give some overview of results from the short duration extreme precipitation, the St. John River experiment on cold season storms, as well as the storms and precipitation across the Continental Divide experiment. So all those projects are linked together, so I tried to represent it here using the different logos. So you can see in the middle the Mountain Water Future and Extremes were the Pillar 3 projects in which different extremes were addressed. So in Mountain Water Futures, mainly extremes from the Mountain West, flooding, rain-snow transitions. And in extremes, it was mainly driven, as for Mountain Water Futures, but in extremes was mainly driven from users and what users need in terms of the different type of extremes. Then to complete those projects, as I said before, SPADE, which involves an experiment in the field, was held in the Canadian Rockies, and then SAGES was a field experiment as well over eastern Canada to study precipitation and flooding events over the St. John River Basin. and also the short-term duration extreme precipitation and the paradigm shift projects. So all those projects use different tools. So we'll hear today from Zenhua the CONUS 2 simulations, but we mainly use the CONUS 1 and the Western Canada simulation. We also conducted very high-resolution simulations we're using the GEM model, for example, for the New Brunswick ice storm, conducted field experiment to learn about processes, and we also use station data and to look at climate change, some pseudo-global warming approach, and also some projection from CMIP6. So those are the topics that were studied. So basically, extreme precipitation, including hazardous precipitation, wet snow, freezing rain, and hail, as well as temperature extremes. And some phenomena studies are near 0 degrees Celsius conditions, convective systems, rain-snow transition, warm spells, drought, and heat waves. So these were studied using various methods for climate change. The pseudo-global warming approach, as you probably all know, is giving us information about the thermodynamical feedback if we have warmer conditions. And then we can use also long-term simulations to look at climate projections. So those are some examples of findings and the activities related to the extremes across projects. So I tried to summarize them into 8 blue boxes like this, but there's more than that. So this is just to give you a summary. So the first one about the mesoscale convective systems. So a lot of work has been done on those factors contributing to their longevity. Some work has been done on the near-zero conditions that will remain or be enhanced in the future. Some work has been done on the precipitation extremes, that rare events tend to intensity more rapidly with warming. We looked at the changes in freezing rain, wet snow in different regions of Canada. Human influence on extreme precipitation has been identified through a novel detection attribution method. Precipitation phase and meteorological factors influencing floods over the St. John River Basin. And then a new approach estimating very long return period of precipitation extremes, and then processes that can lead to precipitation crossing the continental divide in the Canadian Rockies. So these are some examples of findings, and then in the next part of the presentation, I'll give you some examples of those findings that are illustrated to figures. So those are materials that I gathered from the different co-PIs of the various projects. The first example is from Ben Alaya and Francis Weirs, who looked at long-term periods of extreme precipitation. So showing that if you use different methods, for example, to evaluate those return periods, then it gives you different results which highlight the complexity and the importance to study those extreme precipitation and how we study them. And then if we look over Canada-wide scale, so we looked at near-zero conditions across Canada. So for the first time, the distribution of the 2-meter temperature was investigated at hourly base instead of daily base. And then we found that at most stations across Canada, there's a peak at near zero. So this peak at near zero is mainly driven by phase changes, but other factors that can also influence the duration and maintain those conditions. So for example, if we look in the future, we look at the different possibilities. And for possibility 1, for example, the blue and the red, it means that those near-zero conditions will be enhanced or will remain in the future. And while the green, it will not remain in the future, and the yellow did not occur in the past or in the future. So it shows that even if the temperature increases, some of this temperature is stuck at 0 because of the presence of snow or the presence of precipitation. This has many implications on the freeze-thaw cycle, for example, and the occurrence of hazardous precipitation. And then if we look on the scale of Western Canada using the WRF simulations, some work has been done in Yang Pingsley's group about drought and heat waves for agricultural purposes. Then I thought I would do, since there will be synthesis on the regional scale, then I thought I would go over the different extreme studies on the regional scale across Canada. So I'm going to start west and move east. So if we look on the west coast, some studies has been done on the climatology of atmospheric rivers that can lead to flooding, and of course also the catastrophic one that hit BC last November. And also we looked in more detail in the longest duration of those near zero conditions because we found a local peak in Terrace, BC. So the other place in Canada which has the longest duration is St. John's, Newfoundland. And there's this peak, so we thought there was a problem with the data, but it is real. Terrace, BC can have up to 10 days of continuous near zero degrees Celsius temperatures. And if we look at stations around Terrace, so those stations do not have this peak at zero, but Terrace does. Then if we move east over the Canadian Southern Cordillera, so some work has been done on the changes in the elevation of the rain-snow transition, and then it was shown in perspective with the location of ski resorts, showing that in the future, much of the ski resorts will be below or within this transition region, maybe receiving more rain. Then we conducted a field experiment over the Canadian Rockies to better understand how the water in the atmosphere travel and how it's distributed across the continental divide. So we instrumented both sides of the continental divide and simultaneously documented precipitation during 2 months. And then we found that it depends mainly on the depth of the weather systems and the presence of ice crystals aloft that are transported on the other side of the divide, which will influence the distribution of precipitation and the presence of the precipitation on the western side of the divide. Then if we move over the prairies, a lot of work has been done over the prairies, so I divided it in 3 slides. So we have, for example, I start with summer severe weather. So some work has been done using the CONUS simulation as well, and looking at the mesoscale convective systems using an object-based diagnostic evaluation to look at how they move and their trajectory. And the long-lived daytime and nighttime MCS are initiated by different processes. So this was fine from this study in particular. Also, we know that hail can be very damageable, so hail studies has been conducted over the prairies. So this is an example on the map of an increase of hail or hail size over Alberta in warmer conditions. So this is for 2 to 4 centimeters of hail. Then studies of drought has been conducted as well in GWF. So here the message is that drought goes through stages, and this research has been done with CIMI-5 models. And in the future, droughts will last longer on average, up to 1 year, and can be more common. And this is mainly due to one stage in particular, the persistence one, that would last longer. And in contrast, the onset and the retreat will be shorter. So would that be due for evaporation or because of a big precipitation storm that would stop the drought? And the figure on the side is an example of the 1917 to 220 drought stages. And then winter weather was also studied over the prairies, and this unusual tracking October 2019 storm led to the longest recorded duration of Manitoba adhering snow and strong winds. So like 75 centimeters of snow fell during a few days, and 88 hours of near zero condition was observed. And these caused a lot of damages to, for example, the Manitoba hydro infrastructure. Many studies on the changes of freezing rain and wet snow has been done as well over the prairies. And then the presence of this the topography, even if it's not very high mountains, also made a difference in the type of precipitation reaching the surface. So different categories of adhering snow has been defined and also studied using the CONUS-1 simulations. So then, if we move east, so first I skipped Montreal, but then I thought I have to go back to Montreal because we had this extreme ice storm at the beginning of April this year. So this year is the 25th anniversary of the 1998 ice storm, so there was many articles in the news about that in January. And then in April, we didn't really believe that this would happen, but it did. So we have another historical storm with up to 12 millimeters of ice accretion. So we see on the picture here our weather station downtown Montreal that measured ice accretion. And also, well, we measured the particle characteristics, the temperature, and the conditions aloft. And then we can see that during that storm, the temperature increased to really close to zero and remained there for 15 hours. On the South Shore, it remained to near zero for more than 24 hours. And that was during the day of April 5th, and it's only the next morning that the temperature started to increase above zero and melted all the ice. And I like the middle image here that we wanted to show you because we see that after around 6 millimeters of ice, the anemometer stopped working, and that's a good example of a good storm. So when the anemometer freezes and we don't have any wind speed measurements again. And one of the images to show trees that fell on cars just on the street beside my place. My car was fine. It was surrounded by fences, and the branches fell on the fence, so it's good. So we have here a really good case to study because the next day of the storm, in comparison with the 1998 ice storm, it was plus 15. So all the ice melted, and it felt like summertime. But people were out of power for up to 5 days, so it took a long time for Hydro-Québec to connect back the power. So then I'm going to continue over Eastern Canada by talking of some of the work that we've done over the maritime provinces. So we did some work in collaboration with NB Power to study freezing rain. So GWF started, the first call was around the 2017 ice storm over New Brunswick, where more than 50 millimeters of ice fell over the Acadian Peninsula. So this was unexpected. The maximum amount was expected southeast New Brunswick, and then it occurred northeast New Brunswick. Then we looked at why freezing rain occur over southeast New Brunswick, and it's mainly because of the local topography that caused the cold air damming. So it forced the cold air to stay in the lower levels. So when liquid drop falls, it freezes upon impact with the surface. Then when we look at the climate change, we see that there's a significant decrease in freezing rain across the province, except over northwest New Brunswick, where there could be an increase in freezing rain. And then to continue the work over the maritime provinces, we worked on the investigation of the meteorological factors that can lead to extreme flooding over the St. John River Valley. And so we studied the three extreme storms, 2008, 2018, and 19, in comparison to the year 2020-21, during which we did a field experiment. And the field experiment was called SAGES. And during that, we have measured precipitation, amount, and phase. And on this plot here, you can see the snowpack accumulation from the climatology, from the ECCC station for that year, and also all the dots is from the contribution from the community, where we have more than 20 stations that were where snow was measured every day. And then you can see very well the variability. And the day, there's a nice picture here of the river where you can see ice on the southern part and water on the northern part. And that was just after a consecutive 5 days of rain, snow, mixed precipitation. So just to give you an idea of the implication of the community and users into extreme projects. So here I just chose Sagesse as a good example because our 20 stations were volunteers, so basically retired people or school students, grade 5, who were taking measurements. And so this, you can see on the map the distribution of those stations, and then you can see also on the slide the class of grade 5 who were taking measurements every day, and they had many questions, and they learned a lot about the challenges of measuring snow, that it's not easy and there are often errors. And also those data help us as well to better understand those distribution of precipitation. So I want to highlight here this collaboration with the community and the users as well, because in that region where all the snow that melts in the spring and fall and flow in the river and can cause flooding downstream, there's only one weather station. And because of this project, we're able to increase it to a few more weather stations and also to motivate volunteers to do it. So you can see my mom on one of those pictures. She's one of those new passionate volunteer measuring snow. So in summary, in the next presentation, so some key findings and activities were presented here. So I hope that it gives you a good overview of what we have accomplished in the last 6-7 years. And then for the next presentation, Chandra and Zenhua will talk about their work, in Chandra in particular, in one of the projects in particular that I have not discussed in here. And Zenhua, just after, will talk about the KONUS 2 simulations. And then we will end with the contribution from Manitoba Hydro. Well, they were going to give their perspective on extremes from their side. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. It's working. Sorry. Take this one. Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Chandra Rajulapati. I have recently joined as an assistant professor at the University of Manitoba, and I'm here to talk about the project which we have been working on about the paradigm shift in downscaling climate model projections. Dr. Simon Paplaxiu, right now, he moved to University of Calgary. He's a PI of this project. Unfortunately, he's not here, so I'm presenting on behalf of him. This project is developed as a part of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 of GWF project based to understand the changing extreme events over cold regions and also the big data management as well. So here is the overview of my presentation. I'll be introducing a bit of the topic on why we have to use CMIP6 and all, and why a quantile mapping method, a new method which we have developed as a part of this project, is required. And then I'll discuss about the temperature, how we have developed the method for temperature, and then the applications at point scale and a regional scale as well, and then how we have modified for intermittency in precipitation, for using it in precipitation, and then I'll show some projections for Canada. And I'll discuss my journey as a postdoc at the University of Saskatchewan to being an assistant professor in the University of Manitoba. So yeah, we now at this point of time, there is no doubt about the climate change. It is apparent, and there is also enough evidence that the climate change is having extreme events have been changing as a result of this climate change in terms of floods, droughts, and heat waves. Canada, being in the northern part of the globe, is special in terms of faster snow melt and melting glaciers. If you look at the global temperature anomaly, it is increasing at a rate of 0.2 degrees centigrade per decade. But Canada, it's been increasing at a faster rate, almost the double to the global rate. So at this point of time, it is, to combat a climate change, it is important that we have to be prepared and, to adapt, and, the infrastructure has to be resilient to the changing extreme events in terms of floods, droughts, heat waves, or, the wildfires. So the climate models, these are basically, it's a project developed by the World Climate Research Program. And there are several experiments conducted to better understand the past, present, and future of the climate change and variability in a multimodal framework. So here we are currently at the 6th phase, which is CMIP 6, and these projections are extremely helpful for risk assessment. Now, coming to the global temperature anomaly. So before we go and use these climate models or the climate model projections, what we first did initially was to understand how good are these CMIP 6 or the 6th phase of CMIP is close to the reality or not. So we have considered about 340 historical simulations of CMIP 6, and we try to understand how the temperature anomaly is being simulated through these CMIP 6 simulations, historical simulations. So the black line here is the observation, and then we have several observations. We didn't use just one observation. We used 3 different observations. And the red line, if you see there, it is the multimodal mean, and then we have the rest of the around 30 plus models we have. And it seemed to have, the global temperature anomaly is being, simulated well by the climate models. But when we try to divide the regions into different time periods, there is a kind of some inconsistency by the climate model simulations. So in addition to what we have done is not to just look at the changes in the trend or the variability. We move beyond, and then we try to see how good is the autocorrelation properties or the persistence properties of the climate model simulations, which we have a certain confidence that if a climate model is having a similar autocorrelation properties of the historically observed time series, we have some confidence that it is going to predict the future in a better way. So there are a couple of models, for example here, the first row of the autocorrelation. So there are a couple of models where we have certain confidence that they are matching the observed autocorrelation or the persistence properties. But there are also some models which are, quite far from the reality. So what we can do is we can, pick only those climate models where which are close to the reality in terms of, persistence properties, and try to use their future projections in terms of understanding the future global temperature anomaly changes. With respect to the temperature, we also looked at the annual maximum precipitation. How good is the annual maximum precipitation simulated by the climate models? So we again consider different observation data sets. So we try to also bring in the uncertainty of observation data set, and then try to understand how good are these climate models in simulating the annual maximum precipitation. So there are, again, as we saw in the temperature case, that there are a couple of models which are really good, and there are a couple of models which are off from what we have been observing in terms of annual maximum precipitation. It is similar to the droughts as well here. So this is a low precipitation, which we have tried to understand how good are these climate models again, is a question. So if you see in the left figure that we note that the average properties of the, let us say, the drought duration, the drought severity, or the maximum duration of the drought. All the average properties are been well simulated. Like if we consider almost 100 plus simulations and then try to take a multimodal mean, that multimodal mean is close to the reality. But let us say now I want to use one particular climate model for one region, let us say for Canada. It is definitely not possible, because at each grid, we didn't see any particular pattern when we try to put the best climate model for each grid, so there is no clear pattern which is on the right side of the figure. And we also noted that as we increase the number of simulations, the confidence increases. So that's the plot here, as we try to include as many simulations as possible, and then we are getting close to the reality there. So the takeaway message from all these studies is that, the average statistics are better represented, and then there is definitely some bias in the climate model simulations, and then, when we want to use one particular model at Canada scale, we have to do some kind of correction, or downscaling is required at when we want to use one particular climate model and their corresponding simulations. So we had to introduce a quantile mapping method, which is a semi-parametric quantile mapping method, and this we have to introduce because none of the current methods include non-stationarity in the observations. So all these methods, what we have till now, they do consider the non-stationarity in the biases, but when we don't consider the non-stationarity in the observations, we end up with the scaling issues as shown in that plot, that we have a clear discontinuity from the observations to the bias-corrected simulation. So we have to close that gap, or the scaling issues with respect to the quantile mapping method. So we have to introduce this SPQM method. And we have used the EMDNA, which is the Ensemble Meteorological Dataset for North America, as a reference dataset for quantile mapping. So this dataset is a daily scale, and the spatial resolution is at 0.1 degree by 0.1 degree, and the time period is from 1979 to 2014. This ensemble dataset is having almost close to 100 ensembles, but we have taken only the deterministic estimates of EMDNA. And EMDNA is a merged dataset merged by using observations and the reanalysis. So this was developed by Martin Clark's group. And for the climate models, we have considered 4 tier 1 experiments, which are based on the first 4 rows of the table for SSP 1.2.6, SSP 2 4.5, SSP 3 7.0, and SSP 5 8.5, which corresponds from SSP 1 sustainability to SSP 5 the fossil fuel development. So we started with temperature first, and then we have developed a method which is a semi-parametric quantile mapping. So what we did is we first detrend the time series and try to fit empirical distribution for the climate models, but we have used a parametric distribution for the observation. So why we have to use empirical probabilities, because the climate model, when we try to fit a distribution, there is no good fit for any, the data is not really in a natural way. So there are some kind of irregularities in the climate model data. So we have to only consider the climate signal as well as the variability. So that is what we have picked from the climate model. And then we try to match the distribution of the observations with respect to quantile mapping. And then we add back the climate variability as well as the trend after bias correction or the quantile mapping. So that's what we have done in SPQM. And so we applied this for 18 large Canadian cities, and then we tried to project, understand how the temperature have been changing in the historically, as well as how it is going to change for these 4 shared socioeconomic pathways. And we noted, there is a quite large, uncertainty between the scenarios. but not uncertainties kind of small among the climate models after bias correction. So we extended this method. After bias correction, we tried to understand how are the heat waves and the cold waves changing in these 18 large Canadian cities. And then we have noted in some cities that there have been, huge increase in the heat waves and the cold waves. So we extended it to the global cities, and then we noted that, there is no much difference from what we have seen in the global to the Canadian cities. And then, so these are the temperature projections we have for the entire Canada. We have 659 projections for temperature. And we had to introduce intermittency for precipitation as, we have to deal the dry days and the wet days separately. So we had to change our method, and then we have applied for one station and at a bounding box to understand if the bias-corrected projections could able to reproduce the variability, the spatial variability after quantile mapping. So we noted that the bias correction method is pretty good, and it could able to reproduce the spatial variability within the validation period, which was for 14 years we have considered as a validation period. So one is on the point scale and the other one is on the spatial scale. So we also compared with the other quantile mapping methods in the literature. So we try to note that the SPQM has done better than the other quantile mapping methods which are developed in the literature. And we have now 759 precipitation projections for the 4 scenarios, and we try to understand what is the variability for the near future and the far future. So we have a database of observations and the projections from this project, and we have the bias-corrected data or the quantile map data on Norval. And we have the R scripts for the SPQM if anyone is interested in using, and now we are trying to extend this from Canada to the whole of North America, and then we are trying to do some extension of the SPQM to multivariate corrections. So coming to my journey from postdoc to a faculty, it's a quite, memorable journey. Apart from the research work, I have, great mentors, Professor John Pomeroy, Professor Martin Clark, and of course, Dr. Simon Peplaxi from University of Calgary. So their mentorship has helped me really, in having a vision of in terms of both the research as well as my professional, progressing towards in my profession. And then especially when in the GWF project, which I've been involved, I got a opportunity. It is an incredible opportunity basically to work with different teams of GWF, where I have collaborated with core modeling teams and the data management team, and including the IMPC. I used to have conversations with Julie. That's the best part of being involved in a GWF project. I have also a good exposure, and it was John who pushed me to apply for this Pacific Institute for Mathematical Sciences postdoctoral fellowship, and that has opened up a world of opportunities for me to collaborate with mathematicians in the University of British Columbia. And as a part of this PIMS fellowship, I was involved in a Wise Planet project, and that Wise Planet project has took me to involve in the Women Plus Water here in the GWF, which was developed by Dr. Corinne Schuster-Walls. So yeah, I have my poster, the poster number 1. So please do come, and if you have any questions, and we can discuss over there, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Chandra. The next speaker is Zenzua. Oh, yes, yes. Okay. Is that okay like this, or you want to
go full screen?
Super. So I'll stand up when 2 minutes left.
Yes. Okay. Hi, good morning. I will talk briefly about the Columns 2 simulation. For those who are not familiar with this project, it's collaboration between GWF and ANCA and State University of New York at Albany. So this is different from the previous talk. Our downscaling is dynamic downscaling. So I talk about what's the difference between ours and so dynamic downscaling. As you all know, the global climate model has a very coarse resolution, about 100 kilometers or more. And to have the detailed information at regional level, you have to downscale it. So for dynamic downscaling has the benefit of to represent the physical processes in the climate system. So you can have a more realistic representation of precipitation and storms, evolution. So we can get a better estimation of extreme weather in the future and extreme hydrological events. So through higher resolution, we can improve representation of topography and local features such as wetland interchange with atmosphere. Also, through direct representation of convection, we can have better representation of hail development, mesoscale convective systems, and heavy rainfalls, especially those involved with topography. And furthermore, we can have better detail for impact assessments, bridging the gap between global and local scales. But all these have high costs because computing at very high resolution requires much larger computing resources. For example, if you're running GCM, you can afford a time step of minutes or hours, but at convective permission resolution, which you have to resolve storms, you have to run at 10 seconds, in addition to the much larger domain and resolution of spatial resolution. So for this large project, because it costs so much, we have to design very carefully. Before we started, we have to choose parameterization, improve the combination of different resolutions, parameterization combination, and test if it can represent the current climate. And also we have to carefully design the pseudo-global warming scenario to have a better representation of future climate. And here is the main information of this simulation. We use a WRF model, which is a weather forecasting model, but adjusted for climate simulation because we have to consider long-term integration. And the domain covers the most of the North America continent, including Canada, US, and northern Mexico. The resolution is 4 kilometers, which is just the right resolution for representing convection, but cheap enough to do the communication. And for a month of simulation, it takes about several days, so it takes a long time. And the main feature is we don't use any cumulus parameterization, so storms can be, convective precipitation is directly represented through the model without parameterization. And why are we doing another version of CONUS? First of all, we have a larger domain to cover the whole Canada. Secondly, it takes longer simulation and cover more recent periods. Thirdly, we use a different approach of pseudo-global warming. For the previous one, the pseudo-global warming is implemented through, you take the current reanalysis, current weather forcing, you add the mean climate perturbation caused by global warming in terms of thermodynamic changes and also circulation changes. It's a small adjustment. So you basically have the same weather system, but in a warmer and a wetter atmosphere with a very small change in circulation. And for the new method, it's directly from the using a direct GCM simulation, but bias corrected to the reanalysis. So for the future climate, we will have a real adjustment of the storm tracks, real changes in synaptic activity, basically saying we can have different storms in the future. So this is more realistic than the previous one. The previous one is more a change in thermodynamic and the mean circulation. So I will skip this, it's too technical. And for those who want to use this data, we have hourly output for 2D with 184 variables. And I think most hydrological people and agriculture people will need only 7 of them. But we keep a lot of extreme variables such as gust wind and maximum vertical velocity, those kind of things for the severe weather people, if we want to study the future changes of severe weather. And because of this large domain and high temporal resolution, the storage of the data is very large. For the 4-kilometer simulation, we'll need 250 terabytes for one scenario. For another scenario, it will be another 250. And because of the large size of the data set, currently the data is tarred under the model output directory. And to access this data, you have to untar it and using standard NetCDF scripts to extract data. Here I present some examples how to extract several hydrological model data to forcing data from the output. And for access the data, please contact me or the IT team of the GWF for more information, because it's very large data set. If you want to access it, you need our help. Thank you.
Thank you. So our last speakers. Kevin Segan and Scott Herbert from Manitoba Hydro. Is it the right presentation? Oh, okay, great. So you have a timer here?
Okay. Sure.
Make a 5 minutes each.
Yep. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you today on topics of interest to Manitoba Hydro. Kevin and I are both professional engineers within the Water Resources Department, specifically the Hydrology and Climate section within Manitoba Hydro. Our team is responsible for providing specialized engineering and expertise to customers throughout the organization in areas of climate and meteorology, physical and operational hydrology, watershed modeling, and inflow forecasting. Today, we would like to quickly give you a rundown on our utility, the watershed, what we are interested in with respect to weather and climate information, our interaction with global water futures, and where we are headed as we adapt to the changing climate. Earlier, Dr. Wetter mentioned the need to apply the research that many of you are involved in. Manitoba Hydro is interested in this application, and Kevin and I will also try to touch on this topic. So Manitoba Hydro is an electrical utility, as well as natural gas, involved in the electricity generation, transmission, and distribution. On average, more than 97% of our electrical energy is generated from hydropower. Our fleet consists of 17 generating stations, 16 of which are hydroelectric, one of which is thermal. We also purchase power from 2 independent power producers who generate wind energy in southern Manitoba. Our total installed capacity is approximately 6,100 megawatts. In order to move this electricity, we operate tens of thousands of kilometers of transmission and distribution lines and participate in electricity markets outside of Manitoba, including the US. So the water that passes through our hydro generating stations comes from the Nelson Churchill watershed, a very large watershed covering an area of over 1.4 million square kilometers. The watershed extends from the Rocky Mountains to the divide west of Thunder Bay, and from the northern US to the Hudson Bay. As you can imagine, it is diverse, and it encompasses many ecozones, various types of topography and land cover, permafrost, and so forth. So our business is sensitive to weather and climate, and as such, we are interested in understanding how climate change may impact our energy supply, our energy demand, infrastructure and design management, environmental assessment, human resource, and customer service. So a few key points I'd like to make with respect to these sensitivities are as follows. Firstly, as mentioned earlier, approximately 97% of our energy comes from hydropower. A dry year versus a favorable or wet year has significant impact on us as we strive to sufficiently supply the energy of the demands of our province. Secondly, we have a lot of infrastructure covering a large landscape. All are susceptible to a changing environment. Icing and wildfires are a couple of weather-related events that we have encountered and continue to deal with. These events can cause millions of dollars of damage, even hundreds of millions of dollars of damage in the case of the October 2019 icing event. Lastly, our regulator and our stakeholders expect us to understand and disclose how climate change and extremes may impact us as a company. Understanding these sensitivities is essential for us as Manitoba Hydro to capitalize on opportunities while managing risks. So let's take a look at a few examples to further expand on some of the sensitivities to climate change and a utility's perspective in terms of average conditions in this case. So generally, increased annual and seasonal temperatures are projected to lead to reduced energy demand in winter heating, but increased summer cooling, with a net slight decrease in energy demand. Similarly, the net change in water supply, while still fairly uncertain, is generally projected to have impacts on hydropower production and potentially how we plan our future system build-out. Thinking outside of the generation world, there are a variety of sensitivities to our network of transmission and distribution, including the power capacity of our lines, wildfire risks, and access for winter construction and maintenance. Kevin will now continue the discussion on sensitivities with respect to extremes, as well as our interaction with Global Water Futures.
Okay, thanks, Scott. So Manitoba Hydro is also sensitive to changes in climate extremes and indices, and these are a snapshot of some of those. So on the precipitation side, one good example is the probable maximum precipitation, or PMP, and that is an input to some of our inflow design flood scenarios. That's something that we've studied in some previous R&D projects. Another good example is near 0 degree precipitation, which can stick to and add loading to our power lines, and that is something that has been studied in GWF, as Julie showed. We're also sensitive to changes in extreme temperature, so changes in extreme cold can impact our peak energy demand in the winter, while changes in extreme heat can impact, for example, transformer ratings. And then there's also combined events, such as a high temperature, low wind speed scenario that is a design criteria for our transmission lines, or drought, meteorologic and hydrologic drought. So as Manitoba Hydro, we plan our operations to meet the energy needs of Manitobans, assuming the worst drought on record. And so projected changes in drought are a common question to us and of interest to us. So Manitoba Hydro, our climate change response is made up of 5 key strategies, and if you're interested to learn more, we publish a climate change report every 3 to 4 years. For a number of years, we've put a lot of focus on the first strategy, which is to understand the changing climate and extremes. And now while we're continuing to focus on that, we're also progressing towards adaptation. So that's adaptation could take many forms, whether it's infrastructure design, emergency response, or, for example, our improved inflow forecasting system. So as part of this effort, Manitoba Hydro has formed an internal Climate Change Opportunities, Risks, and Adaptation Working Group, or CORA. It has membership from across the enterprise, and they will be identifying, studying, and planning for climate-related risks holistically throughout the corporation. So with our last couple of slides, just to change gears a little bit, we wanted to highlight some of the interactions that we've had with the Global Water Futures project. So we've had the opportunity to work with GWF on several topics. One was the climate-related precipitation extremes project, as you've seen, and among other things that studied icing events that impact our transmission infrastructure, and in particular the October 2019 storm event. We've also collaborated and continue to do so on the integrated modeling program for Canada. For example, the Nelson Basin Watershed Model Intercomparison Project, which is ongoing, and 2 studies looking at changes in water supply and hydropower generation in our basin. And we've seen many benefits from engagement with GWF, and again, these are just a few of them. So first, new data sources are always of interest to us. So participating in GWF gave us exposure to the WRF model, and since then we've just started to apply this in a couple cases for our climate change report and some sub-daily analysis for climate change resilience assessments. Similarly, the study into the October 2019 storm event introduced us to the Manitoba Agriculture Weather Program, and that's a network of weather stations in southern Manitoba. Since then, we've reached an agreement with Manitoba Ag, and that data is now being brought in, and we're using it for our operational forecasting system. And just generally, we've also benefited from a number of collaborations. So for example, the Nelson MIP project has really expanded our communication network with our modeling peers. We've also had R&D projects spur out of this. For example, a project we have ongoing with Julie and Environment and Climate Change Canada, looking at improving winter precip estimates in the Canadian Precipitation Analysis product. And similarly, we're also excited to start collaborating with Dr. Rajulapati at the University of Manitoba as well. So just to finish off then with some high-level next steps, as you've heard, data is of great importance to us. Our watersheds are large, data sparse, and they extend across multiple provinces. So we're very interested in collaboration and data sharing, co-locating gauges, prioritizing network locations, and understanding and applying new data sources. And in particularly now in the areas of snow and soil moisture to improve our physically based modeling. Manitoba Hydro has a history of supporting R&D initiatives, and we're certainly interested in further collaboration in these areas. And overall, we're very keen to mobilize what we learned this week and in the future. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I see that it's 11:15, so there's not much time for questions, but maybe we can take one question while we're switching to the lightning talks. If not, we can discuss at the break as well. John.
Right. A question from Manitoba Hydro. Going into the future, what would be the most useful aspect of information that could be provided as we develop the synthesis for Global Water Futures in terms of your own operations?
There's a lot of ways to answer that question. I mean, one in particular that will be important is the WRF CONUS 2 projections will be very helpful for us. Obviously, partly because it's going to cover our entire watershed. Obviously, it was cut off with WRF CONUS 1 before. So overall, I think that's a good example of something that could be covered that would be very useful to us.
And I think overall as well is I think we've heard it here a lot, is collaboration. So we at Manitoba Hydro do rely on a lot of collaborations, whether it's, and when I say that, I mean at the field level. So when we are installing monitoring equipment, it helps to collaborate and partner with other agencies, whether it's the fire programs, whether it's Environment Canada, Water Survey of Canada. All those partnerships are critical to working together and getting additional data, additional information that we can use. And I use the example of snow. Very data sparse up in our northern Manitoba and surrounding areas, and so any of that type of information goes a long way to help us in the future for sure.
We have a snow model for you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Okay, thank you to all the speakers. Oh, yeah, one question. One last question. Do you want to come upload the presentation? Yeah. Does it work?
Hello. Yeah,
Oh, yeah,
now
okay.
it works. My question is, I know the Saskatchewan River runs into Cedar Lake and then to your biggest dam, I guess, is Grand Rapids. Is there not, I didn't hear you mention about quality of water. I know volume is important to you guys, but for the environment, the important is the starvation of sediment is a big impact for all environment, and that's a proven fact. And then for future, I think there's got to be a way to allow the sediment to continue to flow into the river systems, because down the road there, like we're going to see the same damage that's been done in our province here because of starvation of sediment. The largest delta in North America, and might be the third largest delta in the world, is in jeopardy right now today. It's dying because of starvation of sediment. And I think that's something that's very important that you guys should look into it and make sure nature has the quality of water it needs to survive. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's a session about water quality that will be discussed later. So, yeah, thank you for your comment. Okay, so we'll move now. Thank you again to all the speakers, and we'll move now to the lightning talks. So maybe we can invite the speakers to come.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So hopefully, if you're speaking at this session, you're up here. I think we're missing a couple people. So I'm Nancy Gaucher, and I will be chairing the Lightning Talk session this morning. I'm going to get right to it because we're running a little bit behind. So first up, we have Zelalam Tassama. Do you have slides?
Okay, good morning. Did you know about like how wild forest fire, mountain pine beetles, and clear cut or forest harvesting impacting the hydrology of the upper Columbia River Basin and the Okanagan River Basin? I'm Zelalam Tassama. I will give you some highlights on our recent research work on this. So as you see from the maps, all the forest harvesting, wild forest fire, and also mountain pine beetles affecting the most of the upper Columbia and Okanagan River Basin. So I collect the maps from 1980 to 2018, almost 4 decades of map. As you saw, it's really disturbing the most of the forests in those two basins. And we incorporate this disturbance of the forest into a hydrology model, and we assess their impact. There are two key messages from our research output. One is it improves in simulating flood around the peak times, and also it improves model simulation performance through root mean square errors. So as you see from the map, from the right side, the upper one shows how the fraction of the basins clear-cutted, burn, or infected by mountain pine beetles. And from the middle, you can see how the change in the improvement in root mean square error of the model. So incorporating these dynamics from year to year improve the model performance by reducing the root mean square errors, and it also affects the forecasting skill, especially around the peak time, as you see from the bottom map, which show the hydrograph between the two different scenarios. And I have a poster at 101, so you can pass by that poster for more engagement and discussion. Thank you very much.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much. Next up we have Chiwa He.
Morning. I'm wondering if many of you know why wetlands in the prairies are very important for Canada. But these wetlands have been greatly changed by agricultural growing during the past years. And these changes will significantly increase the risks of extreme high flow and low flow and future climate change in the prairies. So my name is Zhihua He. I'm a postdoctor at the University of Saskatchewan, working with Professor John Pomeroy and Dr. Chris Spence. My research will give our answers to these questions based on a comprehensive assessment of the sensitivity of extremely high flow and low flow to wetland management and climate change over the entire prairies. So how did we do that? First, we divided the entire prairies into 7 sub-regions based on the classification of small basins. Then we used the cold region hydrological modeling platform and a virtual basin as a tool to represent each of the 7 basin types. Last, we forced the virtual basin hydrological models by wetland management and climate change scenarios. Then we have the synergistic results for the sensitivity of annual peak discharge to wetland management of drainage and restoration, as well as the changes in precipitation and temperature. So for more details of our model setting up and more findings, please come to our poster number 19. I will be there and I'm very happy to answer your questions. And thank you very much. Hope to see you there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Next up, we have Lauren Miranda.
Hello, everyone. So I don't have slides. I was thinking of myself today as being like a science sandwich, because before me and after me are some researchers speaking about the research that's part of Prairie Water and like foundational to what we're trying to communicate. But I wanted to focus on that communication part about research today. So what we have on display in the gallery over there at number 22 are 2 infographics that the Prairie Water team has put together to try one way of communicating these research results about wetlands in the prairies. So typically one of 2 ways that we can end up talking about wetlands in terms of research is either first in the way that benefits that they can provide. And so we have one infographic talking about benefits that wetlands have in terms of biodiversity and bird populations. But The other way that we tend to talk about wetlands is how do we quantify what happens when we lose those benefits, and how do we understand those benefits being lost and what changes. So the other infographic we have is about hydrological flows and how does wetland removal have impacts on water movement and connections such as like flooding and groundwater connections too. So we have 2 infographics, and my main message is just please come check them out and let me know if they make sense, and you can like let us know at Prairie Water if they are if they're communicating what we want them to communicate. So that's my message for you today. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Lauren. Next up, we have Shakil Ahmed.
Good morning, everyone. With increasing development pressure in Canada's prairie pothole region, nutrient pollution in Canada's prairie pothole region has become a major threat to the ecosystem service, which may lead to massive economic loss. So an important research question is how the wetland pond nutrients are linked with land use and biogeochemical drivers. I am Shakil Ahmed, a postdoctoral fellow at GWF, and I'll talk about our research on this. To address this question, we have investigated 150 wetlands across the prairie pothole region, and we found that wetlands surrounded by croplands have much higher concentration of nitrogen and phosphorus compared to the grassland and pasture, suggesting that croplands contribute to nutrient buildup in the wetlands. If you give a deeper look in the bottom figure, we see that not all the crop types contribute to the same amount to the nutrients. For example, for nitrogen, the strongest land use source was the pulses, where for phosphorus, the major land use source was the oilseed. We developed a model to quantify the linkages, and we found that nitrogen in wetland ponds are driven or dominated by pond water chemistry, while phosphorus is dominated by land uses. Pond water chemistry showed 1.7 times stronger control on nitrogen compared to land uses, while land use showed 1.8 times stronger control on phosphorus compared to pond water chemistry. We also found that natural vegetation has the potential to attenuate nutrient load by vegetative filtration and plant uptake. So the quantified linkages and insights from the study would help identify management targets and priorities in Canada's prairie pothole region. And we invite everyone to visit our posters. It has ID number of 73. Thank you.
Excellent talk. Thanks so much. And next up, we have Peter Lawford.
Okay, so we were hearing about sediment starvation in rivers, and I'm going to present sediment transport from a little different perspective. My name is Peter Lawford. I'm a PhD candidate under John Pomeroy, and I want to tell you about sediment transport on the prairies, on the Canadian prairies. Sediment erosion on agricultural fields picks up phosphorus, absorbs it, and transports it into aquatic ecosystems where it can cause damage. So sediment transport is generally driven by either rain splash or by flow-driven processes under snowmelt. And we've taken a model, Morgan Finney and Van Ryn, And we've incorporated into the cold regions hydrological model so that we can do some simulation on the Canadian prairies, focusing on the cold regions aspect, which are unique to the prairies. So we've added in the frozen soil component as well. And we've run the model in the area of the South Tobacco Creek, which is a well-instrumented well-instrumented area for water quality, and has quite an agricultural component to it, and also has quite a variety of slopes. And if you want to see the model results, you can come to my poster at poster number 23. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. Last up is Alex Zahara.
Hello, everyone. My name's Alex Zahara. I'm a scientist with the Prince Albert Grand Council, PAGC Forestry in particular. So I'm here to present and to talk a bit about our poster, which is for the We Are Fire group, which is led by Renee and Solomon Carrier out of Cumberland House on the Cumberland Delta. So I don't have any visuals with me. However, we do have an absolutely beautiful poster that's over in the poster section. It's in both English and Cree, and it talks a bit about the We Are Fire project. For those who are unaware, there's important aspect of maintaining the land is cultural burning on the Saskatchewan River Delta. So for basically since the 1980s, the province suddenly started telling folks you're unable to burn. Historically, trappers burned, particularly Phragmites. Very, very tall grass, between about 6 feet, 12 feet tall, as a way of maintaining it and sort of keeping it at bay. After the province basically said you're no longer allowed to burn, Phragmites ended up increasing a lot in size, and through that has resulted in a lot of ecological damage. So the We Are Fire project is a community-led project that we've been working with at PAGC Forestry, supporting Renee and Solomon, who are really the leaders of this. It's rooted in understandings of fire, understandings of community and well-being that stem from the Saskatchewan River Delta. So to initiate this project, Renee and Solomon, and particularly Solomon, did interviews with 15 elders and knowledge holders about using fire on the Saskatchewan Delta. You can learn a bit more about fire and how fire has been used differently over the last thousands of years in the River Delta on the new We Are Fire website. So you can find out more about that there. The infographic is sort of a knowledge output that's part of a larger project. It's also, with that, we've been doing a series of camps as well, in which we're really trying to emphasize that bringing fire back and maintaining ecological well-being is really involves all of the community. So as you'll see on our poster, some of the things that we really tried to consider is who is involved in doing fire management. So we have people with different genders, different abilities that are included on there, because that's going to be important for bringing fire back to the land. Thank you. You can go and check out the poster. Dr. Graham Strickard and I are here if you have any questions about it. And again, thanks to Renee and Solomon, who've really been instrumental in putting this project forward. And again, wearefire.ca is the website, and you can learn more about that there. Thank you.
Thank you again. That concludes our first lightning talk session. So let's give a round of applause to everyone once again. Please join us this evening for the poster session with cocktails and tapas, and you can learn more about the research that's undergoing. Thanks.
Okay, so we got one more session before we break and
go to our nice visit to Wanaskewin. So I'll ask all the panelists on my panel to please come and sit up here. Chris, Carl Eric, others, and I'll get started right away. How do I get this to work here? Help me with this. I'm not sure how it's not moving, but it's not working. What a fun. Is that showing up? Okay, great. Okay, so what we'll do today is talk a little bit about changing water budgets and cryospheres and rivers. And so we've got some examples of what we've done. This is largely derived from the core modeling group. So hopefully this is of interest to folks. So, you know, John mentioned earlier, we're talking a lot about synthesis, right? So we're going to be really focusing on synthesis over the next year as we pull all this together. So I'm happy and very pleased to have some great speakers coming up to give you a very high-level talk about what we've accomplished in a few spots, but there's obviously a lot more because we're working on this for a long time, right? So we have Mohammed Al-Shami is going to talk a little bit about the North and some of the work we've done on forecasting and some climate change work, some advances in forecasting from Carl Eric, looking at river ice as a strong example, and then looking towards the future a little bit with the next generation snow forecasting system. And then I've asked Prabin to come up and talk a little bit about knowledge integration. He was a key part of the core modeling team. He's now moved on, but he'll talk a little bit about what it takes to actually do knowledge integration, knowledge mobilization, and hopefully enough time for some questions and answers. So it should be a quick and exciting panel for everybody. So just quickly, those of you who've been around long enough know they've seen this slide many times. We're going to focus on just a couple of issues here with respect to the core modeling. So Julie and her team talked about spatial meteorological data. We're going to focus a little bit more on sort of the current and next generation modeling and a little bit on the forecasting side. What I wanted to do is make sure that you all understood that a lot of our work has actually made it into industry, in a sense, that a lot of people are using the models that we've developed, and we hope that through synthesis this will continue on. So the examples you're going to see are pretty profound when it comes to the North, but also really interesting when it comes to applications. If you recall, we looked at, if you remember from the map, these are the basins we chose to focus on for Global Water Futures, although John mentioned earlier, we've done a lot more than this, but we actually did commit to doing climate change runs and forecasting for these basins, and that's all coming along, and most of it is actually done. So we came up with a workflow for the production runs for climate change, as you can see there. And we've done a lot of benchmarking for the models. We've got a series of different models that we've looked into, and we've done some improvements in terms of glacier representation, water management and irrigation. We've moved to a model-agnostic framework with our vector-based land surface and routing models, and we've done some international basins as well, which we'll talk about on Wednesday. One of the models we've used, and it's not the only one by any stretch, is the mesh model that many of you are familiar with. So we've added some components like irrigation and abstraction to that model, which has never really been done. And so now we can run a full water budget model for the places like the Saskatchewan Basin, which are heavily irrigated in southern Alberta, and all of that's available. It includes some detailed routing as well through reservoirs, and so all of that is very important to try to make these models mimic what's happened historically and obviously into the future. We've done things like added HGDM, which was developed by Kevin Shook and John Pomeroy. That's a prairie pothole model, right? So we've made a a version of this model that now ties into both mesh and to the HYPE model, which is another model we've used in the system. And so we've tried to make these components as model agnostic as possible. And so we've just got a paper coming out soon on the mesh HGDM model as an example. And just to give you a flavor of some of the examples, this is the climate change runs on the Saskatchewan River Basin. I'm not going to go into any details at all, but just to show you that we were capable of doing this. These results will be published and will certainly be part of the synthesis that we're doing. And so this gives you a sense of the precipitation changes, both annual and seasonal. So you can see there's some pretty significant changes in precipitation that we're going to see in the basin, mostly some increases with a few decreases in the colder months. And then you'll see here some temperature changes as well. And again, these are pretty significant changes in temperature that we're going to see in the basin in the future. And so those were applied, plus changes in radiation. I won't go into details, changes in some of the other forcing variables to produce basically what we think are the changes in stream flow for the basin in the future. And so this is just one example of many that we'll pull together in the synthesis report so that, this will be really, I think, the first comprehensive assessment of climate impacts in Canada that I've done with a model that has, or a few models that have really sort of all the necessary physics to make these things work. So it's a real benchmark, I think, for GWF and a real turning point in our strategy in Canada to look at what the impacts in hydrology will be from climate change. So it's pretty exciting to be at the end of this and to see the horizon coming here with that. One of the things I should mention is we've done some nice work with models and agnostic frameworks, and so we've really, one of the big issues with hydrological modeling is a lot of people, so when you look at hydrologists, every hydrologist has their own model, some have two. And so what we tried to do was make sure that the models that have been developed, we can move to more of an agnostic framework where people can actually run different hydrological models. The other big issue in hydrology is repeatability. You have somebody running a model, they make changes, they make tweaks to the model. You can't repeat what happened with that model. And so we've gone to a framework where a lot of the tools for dissecting and dividing up the basins are automated. And so we tested that out this February, actually. I'm involved in a study on the St. Mary Milk River. It's a small basin in southern Alberta. And so we invited people to try to set up four models. In the end, we had Raven there as well. So Mesh, Suma, which is Martin Clark's model, and HYPE, which is the one from Sweden, and Raven. And we used to take about a month and a half to set up a model. They had basically 12 hours. And so we sat them in a room, kind of locked the door. I brought in lunch and said, okay, see if you can get this your model's working in this basin for a 10-year simulation in 12 hours. And they did it, right, with some help. So we've made some quick advances, I think. This is all GWF focused, and so we've really made some strong advances in Canada here. And so what I'd like to do now is go through a few examples of some case studies and some examples where people can show you some of their results on some of the studies, and then we'll hopefully have 10 minutes at the end for questions. So Mohammed, if you can come up and sort of describe what you did for Mackenzie.
Good morning. Well, when I started on the Mackenzie, I didn't have the privilege to use the quick kind of setup that Al mentioned, so I had to go through the month of development. But at the end of the day, it paid off. So here is a quick look at the Mackenzie River Basin, the largest in Canada. And one particular focus of this work was to include the hydrology and the permafrost together. And for the permafrost, we had to look at the observations, and you can see they are all concentrated on the Mackenzie corridor and nothing outside that. And so the objective was to develop this model which is capable of projecting climate change scenarios and land use change scenarios, and together with looking at the hydrology and how the permafrost changes. We first calibrated to the hydrology, but I'm not showing that. You can see it in the poster, number 103 there. But I will show some validation work for the permafrost. And these are 3 sites with good observations. And you can see the model is kind of picking the range of them. We have 15 ensemble members, and most of the observations fall within that range. Because we didn't have enough data, we had to look at spatial data sets and to see how they match our model. And you can see a couple of them there. And we didn't only look at these, we looked at whatever is available. And you can see the range of areas, permafrost underlain areas in the Mackenzie River Basin, and how they match the different types of observations or quasi-observations, because these are like model results from different methods, statistical methods, thermal modeling, machine learning, whatever. We try to match as much as possible. Now we go to the more interesting part on the impacts, significant impacts on the stream flow. You can see most of the time it shifts earlier, it goes higher for the sub-basin outlets, and the base flow goes higher as well. So that will all have implications for water supply, for flooding, for many of the water-related aspects in Canada. Now, the more scary one is this one, the permafrost. You can see this is an animation going from 1950 to 2100, and you can see things are disappearing. No permafrost, almost 10%. And you can see on the other side the temporal evolution of this, like the horrible slide that is taking. So by the end of the century, we may have only like 10% of the permafrost we have now. So that's, in summary, we managed to build the model. Now we can build it faster with the new agnostic framework. And there are some very significant impacts on the hydrology that are mentioned throughout the talk. So like maybe 30 to 50% higher peaks for the sum of the sub-basin outlets, earlier by 2 to 6 weeks. Snow cover also, I haven't shown that, so snow cover is reduced. It starts accumulating earlier and peaks later, and ends earlier, melts earlier. We see increases in ET, and mostly precipitation will increase as well. So there are some of the significant impacts that we expect based on the climate change scenarios that we ran. So this is the first example. The second example, which is more of a practical application of the mesh modeling framework, we developed a forecasting system for the Yukon sub-basin. And this is now has been handed to the Yukon government. We have been running it ourselves for a while, but now they have taken over successfully. We run this using the meteorological forecasts from the Met Services of Canada. We use the inputs. It gives a lead time of about 10 days in total. And this is like the timeline for the forecast. We run for the previous day to just update the model states. Then we take it into the future. There are 2 types of model simulations that are run concurrently using the forecasts from the Meteorological Service of Canada. So this is the whole basin. We are just focusing on the Canadian part. So this is the light blue one on the map. This is a zoom in on the several sub-basins of that basin. And the forecast runs on the cloud, so we don't use any of the computational resources for running it. We used it, of course, for developing it. And it's semi-automated, like it's automated, so every day around maybe 4:30 a.m., it finishes everything and sends an email to the Yukon government guys, and then they have the forecast. They reach the office, they have the charts, and this is an example of the charts, so they can see how the water balance components change and how the river is responding to that in the top graph there, and the different lines correspond to different models. We had one big model for the whole area, and we had a few sub-catchment focused models using a bit higher resolution, and they kind of provide some kind of uncertainty range for the forecasters of the Yukon government to work with. So that's a model setup, and you put a mesh model setup, you put in action for forecasting, and they use it, I think John mentioned in the morning, with the help of the forecasting for the Klondike, it helped them with evacuating for a flood event that happened last year or the year before, I think. Oh, right now, the second one, because there was an episode in 2020, now there is another one now. So it's good to know that it's still in action. And we're still running it in the background, but they are taking over. So that's all from me, and I saved you some time.
Yeah. So next we'll get to ask Carl Eric to come up and give us some history of all the great work he's done. He's like the river ice whisperer for Canada, I think. So he'll talk to you about some of the applications he's developed and some of the tie-ins he's had with industry as well. So, Carl.
Thank you. What I've been working on many years now is ice jam flood forecasting. So a lot of the data that Mohammed just explained to us for meteorological forecasts that would go into this to run the hydrology model here, the hydrological model that I have indicated in the figure. But those flows then have to go into a river ice model for the river. And there's other data that has to go in there with river ice. It's quite a chaotic process. You don't have for a certain flow a certain water level, a deterministic relationship. It's because of the ice, and depending also on the volume of ice and also where the ice jam is located. You don't have that relationship anymore. And so you have to, in a Monte Carlo context where you repeat runs many, many times with different inputs from frequency distributions, you can then determine a probability of flood levels. And this has been quite successful, and that methodology has also been implemented in a operational ice jam flood forecasting system operated by the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. And we've also extended the methodology to also include freeze-up jamming, but also midwinter ice jamming, particularly here on the St. John River in New Brunswick. We've also extended it to not just immediate forecasting, but also to outlooks. Outlooks are, I guess, forecast too, but more long-term, maybe a month or maybe even 2 months beforehand to see what the severity of flooding could be. So here's a longitudinal profile of the lower Red River, and that's the lower line is the river bottom, and then I have lines here of percentiles, 10, 50, and 90% of what the severity could be, and the pink dots show what actually happened. So it's fairly close, but not as severe. The blue dots show 1 in 100-year flood levels, but it does give an indication of severity. Yeah. And this has actually led into flood hazard and risk assessment and mapping. So in this case, what's been people have been very interested in is mitigation effects. So ice jam mitigation, there's several ways you can reduce the severity of ice jam flooding. You could use dikes or ice control structures, but one that's fairly popular is using an amphibex machine. It's in stream, but you don't have to touch the riverbed for this mitigation method. And the theory here is that you break up the ice before the ice jam season so that any ice that comes down the river doesn't get hooked or lodged at those stations, and you can actually try to move the jamming location further downstream away from a high-risk area. And that modeling we've done some modeling now for Fort McMurray, for the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo. We've also translated these. On the left here, you see an ice jam. Actually, that's the black is the ice. The orange line again is the red is the riverbed. The blue line is the discharge without the water level for the same discharge without ice. You can see here actually that with the ice, you can get water level increases of over 10 feet, 10 meters actually, and this can then be translated into flood maps, which is also very useful, and also been working on looking at the impacts of climate change. This is now a new project actually with National Research Council of Canada for the Exploits River. And look how things will change in the future. But also, the Exploits River is a very regulated river. So looking at how, extending this methodology for regulated rivers, and just to see also in what affect different operations of a dam and water management strategies can also counter the effects of climate change. Okay, thank you. I'll leave it at that.
So obviously we've had some major impact, I think, on industry, on governments, and through GWF over the last 7 years. So now we'll look to the future a little bit with our youngest member of the panel to talk about where things are going to go down the road here. So, and some of Chris's work has actually been adopted by some agencies, so that was great news. So Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Al. Yeah, so I'm Chris Marsh. I'll be talking about Snowcast, which is kind of this next generation snow forecasting system. So the motivation here is to be able to provide estimates of snow water equivalents, the mass of snow over really large spatial extents, so like the Canadian, US Rockies, the Cordilleras. They're the headwaters of major rivers. But we're going after this with modeling because with remote sensing of the massive snow of SWE, it can be quite difficult. So airborne LiDAR, small areas only coming up with snow depth. It's difficult to apply under dense forest canopies. And then satellite-derived snow depth has large errors in steep topography. And then microwave-based methods, they're typically unsuitable for really deep snow, sub-canopy, wet snows, ice lenses. So this really motivates a hydrological model and snow physics models that can account for all this heterogeneity, and that's in mass, energy fluxes, and this is from steep slopes, lots of shadowing, a lot of the intermixed canopies and open areas. And then because of this heterogeneity, it really motivates using a snow drift permitting scale. So this is kind of like a length scale of like 0.1 meters to a couple hundred meters. So on the right here is an image showing a 5-meter LiDAR-derived snow depth map. The blues are deep snows, and the lighter colors are eroded snows. You can see there's a lot of spatial variability here. So to do this, I'm using the Canadian Hydrological Model, CHM. This is a model I've developed during my PhD and then through Global Water Futures. It uses a variable resolution representation of the topography, so this allows us to use fewer computational elements than traditional raster approaches, kind of in the order of 90% fewer computational elements. So this allows including more physics, such as the redistribution of snow, canopy impacts, blowing snow, more complex representations of the wind field at a fraction of the computational, that a raster approach would need. So Snowcast is a nightly run of CHM. It produces snow depth and snow water equivalent for about 1.3 million square kilometers over Western Canada and the Northwest United States. It's driven using a 2.5 kilometer, 2-day forecast from Environment and Climate Change Canada, which is the High Resolution Deterministic Prediction System, HRDPS. It produces these outputs, which are then represented on the web as interactive leaflet maps. And then there's a full data processing pipeline in Python to produce these outputs, which are then used by collaborators. And so the outputs are in rasterized TIFF formats, and they're used by Alberta Environment and Protected Areas and the City of Calgary. So these outputs of SWE are ingested into their modeling tool chains, and they provide insight into the snowpacks in the mountains for basins which are not covered by their observations. These are then used to produce flow estimates for downstream communities. Anecdotally, the Snowcast outputs have been extremely useful to these groups, reducing model spin-ups for them by about 75%. So it's allowing them to more quickly iterate on providing their forecasts. So being able to run a model like this with all the different snow physics is really computationally expensive, and this is only possible due to the high-performance computing advances made to CHM during the GWF collaboration. So this is with core computer science, core modeling. Without too much details here, essentially we're able to harness hundreds and thousands of CPUs by distributing the computations over these compute nodes using the message passing interface, MPI. So on the right here is a diagram showing what that domain decomposition looks like. So each processor is working on some small piece of the simulation domain. Because of this, we need more advanced numerical methods. So incorporating better, more advanced parallel linear algebra solvers that can provide these global solutions. Advances to our parameterization, such as taking an avalanche scheme that was never designed to be run in these large spatial extents and making it usable within an MPI context. And then being able to regrid these outputs because it's an unstructured mesh. Most post-processing tool chains cannot handle this. So being able to use high-performance computing to be able to provide outputs that the end users are interested in. So very quick evaluation here. This is snow-covered area for the modeled in red and the observations from Landsat 8 and Sentinel-2 in teal. And throughout the year, we're getting very good agreement. The ups and downs are because we're sampling small subsets of the domain, just because of the satellite passes, that those aren't ablation events. And then through the spring and the summer, we have really good agreement with our observations, and this is in part due to incorporating the physics of redistribution, so blowing snow and avalanching, where we are able to represent explicitly late-lying drifts and avalanching. So thank you very much.
So thanks, Chris. So those of you who don't know, this is probably the most sophisticated snow model in the world right now. So we're very proud to see it as an outcome of GWF, just like all of our other models. So the last talk is a little bit different, but it's something that I know a lot of us are passionate about. As a former government person, I always struggled with research, making it into operations. It was always a challenge for us when I was with the Water Survey. And so I thought we would spend a little bit of time looking at knowledge integration. What does it take? I think we did a great job with GWF in knowledge integration. And so we just wanted to reflect a little bit on maybe things we can do down the road. And so I've asked Prabin to come give a little bit of a talk on knowledge integration. So Prabin.
Thanks all. Hi everyone, my name is Prabin. You may also know me as the person who is stopping you from your lunch, but I promise it's going to be a very quick one. What we are focusing here is that, so there's a lot of role in knowledge integration by everyone, but the focus of this talk is more on what the research community can do. So if you look at the research community, we have done so much advances, right? So we have a lot of new satellite data that's coming on and giving us a real-time data. We have done, developed very complex models, and we can do a lot of predictions and things like that. We have done new cool treasures. So there's so much significant science advances that we have made in the research community. But then if you come to a practice, then a lot of our models are actually just on a spreadsheet, powered by VBA and macros, right? So there's a lot of this gap between what's really happening in the academia and research community and then what's really happening at the end users and practitioners. So the question we're asking is, does the academic research have a practical relevance in hydrology? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. So what is the issue? So why is this happening? So first thing is that we have so many opaque data models and methods, right? So still many publications don't require to publish the data and codes. And so if the data and codes is not available online or not accessible to everyone, then it's hard to replicate those results and findings. And it's hard to add up them as well. And some of the work that's being done is done by using very expensive softwares and hide behind the paywalls, and then some end users may not be able to use those softwares and pay for that, so that restricts those applications. Similarly, at end users, you may have inadequate end user capacity, right? So they may not have all the tools and resources that's available in research community. And practitioners are also occupied with day-to-day operation management, so they have a lot of tasks that they have to do. So that allows them a little time for innovations and other new developing new advances. And when you're talking about developing new advances, that's science advances. It also means like the end users have to get new skills and develop new partnerships and also do new investments. And so there's a lot of resource demand and time demand put by these new advances for adoption. And some of the basins, like transboundary basins, they are using advances. They're bringing advances. It's much more challenging because like it's complex and a lot of stakeholders are involved, and sometimes you don't have enough data and resources. So sometimes it's preferred that simple methods are preferred. Similarly, there's also issues with scaling and system integration challenges. So it's still, nowadays a lot of YANSERC and other programs have started to ask researchers to transfer the knowledge and tools, but that is still not a requirement for many agencies, and that's still not happening in many cases. And sometimes the scale that we do research and the scale we manage our water resources are quite different, so they don't align, so then it makes it very challenging to upscale or downscale your resource finding and then actually use that in operational or in water management. And also sometimes, integrating new research, and you have already existing management platforms and systems. So when you want to try new things, then it takes time and it's much more complicated. Similarly, there's sometimes low ownership and collaborations with the end users. So if somebody develops some cool thing and just comes to us and say, hey, this is a cool thing, do you want to use it? And we'll say, nope, sorry, because sometimes I know, like, we understand it's challenging, right? Stakeholder engagement is challenging in research because it's time consuming, and bringing everyone together is quite challenging. But the problem is that if researchers and users are not collaborating, then researchers are less likely to understand the practitioners' needs, and practitioners are less likely to uptake the research finding if there is no co-production of knowledge together. And sometimes practitioners are hesitant to adopt the tools that they're not familiar with, right? So if somebody develops some cool tools and just give it to them, then they have no idea how to use that. So they're very hesitant to use those new tools and softwares. And there's also issue of user support and sustainability. So when you are getting some tools sometimes from commercial companies, you know that there's a guaranteed service provided, there is the sustainability of the tools, but then sometimes with research that's not the case, because research has a time frame, projects, and then when the project ends, then that you don't know if that services or that tools or that data is going to be available beyond the research projects. But then in operational management, you need something that's going to last for longer, right? So you cannot change every 2-3 years, so that makes it challenging. So providing user support still is not a built-in part of the research projects, but that we think it should be. And yeah, as I mentioned before, like the knowledge and services generated by research projects may discontinue. That's still a possibility. And sometimes if you have some computer systems, operational automation systems, then like they have so many like cybersecurity and infrastructure limitations, so integrating knowledge is not as simple as it can be. So now, so we know there is a gap between the research and practice, and bridging this gap, sometimes often called as murky middle, is very significant. Then the question is, who should be bridging this gap between the research and practice in hydrology? So there are also some boundary organizations and knowledge mobilizers that help us to bridge this gap between the research and practice. But I argue that it's a shared responsibility, and everyone has a job. Everyone has a role to contribute, and it requires partnerships and collaboration of all stakeholders. So if it's a shared responsibility, then the question is, what can the research hydrology community do to bridge this gap? So I'll be focusing on more that one and giving some few suggestions that we come up with. One is to do the user engagement and knowledge co-production, like sharing data ownership, incorporating local feedbacks in your models, communicating your research findings, technology transfer, etc. This kind of activities will help in user engagement, and also involving in users from beginning of the project, not when you have all the products available at the end of the project, but from starting, involve them and bringing that stakeholder partnerships together. Similarly, capacity building and knowledge transfer, right? So incorporating capacity building, knowledge transfer as a part of the research project proposal and plan, so you know that that's going to come out of that. And also acknowledging and rewarding the contributions that the researchers do in knowledge mobilization, because it takes time, right? Bringing stakeholder, collaborating with them takes time. So what's happening is that, especially from early career perspective, when you want to go for tenure or promotions, then the things that count is like citations, how many papers you have, how many research funding you have. But that is also important, but also acknowledging the contribution that the researchers is doing for end users, providing that support, if that is also like rewarded, if the university reward that as well, I think that will help as well. Also promoting sustainable open science, right? So all the model and codes that we develop should be shared, and also where possible written by using the public domain software. Similarly, we have to, so when we're talking open source software, there's also concern about the sustainability and long-term availability of these codes and these platforms. So we have a lot of these open source libraries, but there is no guaranteed funding mechanism for that. So I think it's a responsibility for everybody, like governments, universities, to create an environment so that those codes and libraries is going to be available for longer term. Otherwise, it's possible that next time there's some update, and then that those systems cannot be used in the future. Also designing our education system and making it more adaptive, right? So designing new courses that addresses new challenges, and also takes advantage of the new advances in the computing, programming, and implementation that has happened. We also recommend including practical work experience is a part of the graduate studies as well. I know CREATE and some other program has done that where they send the graduate student for internship as well, but that's not very common. I mean, in the undergrad it's very common, but not in the graduate level. But then that gives an opportunity for students to go to some end users or industries and learn about how the work culture is there and find some solutions to some of the challenges they are facing. And at the same time, also introducing research and some science publication at undergraduate level as well, because it's possible that a lot of people don't do graduate studies, so they do undergrad and they may go to work in end users like in governments or on the industry. Then if they are not too familiar with how the research and science publishing work, and then they are less likely to read the journal papers and things like that. And finally, to build the bridges between the practitioners and researchers, right? So providing practitioners opportunity to engage in academia. It could be like adjunct professorship, guest lectures, student course supervisions, or being co-PI in the research. At the same time, also for faculty to, I mean, usually I see a lot of faculty taking a sabbatical in another university, but instead of taking another university, going to the government research organizations or watershed organizations or things like that, so then there's more knowledge transfer and collaborations. And since journal publication is also one of the important source for knowledge gateway, we did some assessment of the top 6 hydrology journal, and we found that less than 5% of the editors and chief editors were from outside the academia. But then also inviting them there, that we thought is another opportunity. And so we wrote a commentary paper on that. Al and I did a commentary paper on that, and much more discussions than what I said today is available there. So if you are interested, the paper is there. Thank you for your time and attention.
So hopefully that gave you a bit of a summary of what we've done in GWF. I think we've accomplished a lot. We had, just in the core modeling team alone, I think we had about 40 research associates, postdocs, others involved with developing all the modeling tools. And this is just a small smidgen of the whole effort, right? And we had, I think, in GWF, a really strong focus on knowledge mobilization. That came in from the beginning. We met with the users at the beginning. We moved everything forward. And so that was, I think, highly successful, and a lot of lessons learned. And as we go through the synthesis, we'll certainly write up about that, what worked, what didn't work, how do we make it better for Canada and for the globe, right? And so with that, I wanted to make sure we had time for questions, and we do, right? So at 12:30, we're heading out, Chris. And so we got about 10 minutes for questions. So would appreciate some thoughts, questions, criticisms, whatever you got. Please throw it at the panel here. We got some people willing to answer and talk about whatever you'd like them to talk about. So yeah, grab a mic and give us some questions. Make them hard. Okay, am I going to have to pick somebody to ask a question? No questions. Oh, there we got a question over there. Great, thank you. Is there a mic sitting around, or I'm not sure what's going on?
Hi.
Hey there.
So I'm trying to make some efforts to come up with a good question. Just coming back from Australia, and sorry I missed some of the presentations here, but it's very interesting, the knowledge mobilization piece and indigenous context that you provided. So in the past 6 months, I've observed some interesting indigenous knowledge stuff in Australia. I just wonder how you see we can export the knowledge we've gained in our co-creation of knowledge, or whatever you call them, to other regions experiencing similar issues, or what we can learn from them. So what I've learned so far is that, of course, I mean, they have a different type of ways of knowing, for example, in Australian indigenous people, but at the same time, a lot of similarities. And basically, now post-colonial reconciliation efforts. I just wonder if you could reflect on that and see how we can export the knowledge we've gained over the past 7 years in that sense.
Yeah, that's a great question, Saman, and welcome back. So I think from the KM perspective here, and I don't want to put words in those folks' mouth, you know, one of the things we did in Global Water Futures was we engaged early and often, right? And that was a real success. You know, did we engage early and often enough? Hard to say, right? So I think what we need to do is really reflect on the successes and the failures where we didn't actually meet our objectives on the KM side, on you know, working with First Nations in Canada, and be self-critical, but also be optimistic about the future. So I'm hoping that with the synthesis, this will be with John and the SMC coming together, we can really focus on both those aspects, right? The KM efforts, right, with our Indigenous engagement, and make sure that what we produce coming out of the synthesis is something that's valuable. And I don't see why it wouldn't be valuable globally. And so hopefully we'll get enough uptake from the global community to be able to kind of move the yardsticks forward around the world. So that's a great question. Thank you. Yes.
My name is Aurelie McPherson, and I'm with the Calling Lakes Eco Museum, and we're all about the United Nations 17 Goals of Sustainable Development.
Yeah.
These presentations have been fabulous. I had no idea the breadth of work that was being done and the capacity that it will help with building community confidence. So one observation, would you consider on a go-forward basis weaving some of the goals on your slide presentations so that it can kind of connect local to global, global to local actions?
Sorry, I didn't quite get, so you want us to what, sorry?
So the United Nations has developed the 17 goals to get us to our 2030, 2050 goals agenda. Would you consider, when you do your presentations, embedding those slides onto the, just so that you show that you're doing local to global, global to, would you consider that?
I get it now, thank you, yeah. So that's a great suggestion, actually, and I think it's something that I mean, obviously a lot of those SDGs are tied to water, right? And so it makes a lot of sense to do that. I know we've been working on that. There's gonna be an international panel on Wednesday as well, talking about UNESCO and the UN work that was happening in New York at the Water Summit. And so there's a lot of tie-in there as well, right? So I think, yeah, the UN Development Goals are intrinsically linked here, but having it explicitly linked is probably a good idea. So yeah, I appreciate the comment. Anybody else? For our other panelists, they're sitting there twiddling their thumbs, so it'd be nice if somebody asked them a question.
Hello, thanks for the talks. Just a question here about making our models and code more accessible to maybe a wider audience through putting, you know, web apps on the internet or something like that. Or do you have any hints about, you know, documentation to make our work more accessible to other scientists or even the general public, hopefully?
Yeah. So maybe everybody's got a mic, right? So maybe I'll let some of our panelists talk. I don't know, Mohammed, did you want to mention anything about the modeling we've done and how you make that accessible?
Well, we put the model setups on GitHub, so they are accessible, but of course, maybe it takes a little bit after the publication comes out. We publish our data also to the Canadian Federation for FRDR website, and these are large volumes of data, so they will be accessible there, and then from the GitHub we will put links to these data sets so that you can download them and reproduce our stuff. A lot of the model agnostic framework is also in the same line of trying to reproduce the same model setups and the same model runs, so that you can replicate things and make sure you for yourself that what we have is what you are getting. I think
Yeah,
maybe.
Chris, do you want to add to that? Or?
Yeah, and so one thing I've really noticed by making a model available, people will use it. And so envisioning the documentation not as a one and done, but a continually updated piece of living explanation about your code. So having other people use it and things that are very clear to you, the model developer, are not clear to them. And so making sure you've solicit that feedback and integrate that into your documentation I found to be really important. And then just kind of a point on all the data that goes into these models and is output. Some of those CHM runs I showed might be like 40 terabytes of data. And so making that available is very difficult. But by coming into it with a reproducible workflow from day zero, and all of the post-processing scripts, all of the pre-processing scripts are just part of your own workflow, that your outputs are always ephemeral, you can always regenerate them. Then you can pass it off to somebody else and have them be able to get to where you were without having to make all of those data available. I found to be quite useful. Then you don't have to make 40 terabytes of data available to everybody. So using all the open source tooling, so GitHub, GitLab, to be able to make your source code available and being quite rigorous in doing so. And so not just a tiny terse commit where you say, I updated and fixed a bug, but explain why. Link the documentation, link the literature that you might have used to inform that model decision that's then in your code. Because then, I mean, it's great for yourself, but then others coming into it can then look at the commits and understand what's changed without having to come back to you. And just being on top of that all of the time, I found to be very useful, as opposed to just, I got to get documentation done, and then it's not going to be very good.
Carl, do you want to?
And maybe a little different approach that I've taken is to write a book on river ice processes that contains the model, and each chapter, it starts with a theory part, and then the end, the second half, introduces exercises, and there are tutorials online on how to run the model, and the second edition will come out too in January, where you can do a whole setup and build your own systems for forecasting and also for ice gem flood hazard and risk. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Prabin, did you have anything to add, or are you good?
Not much, but I remember like when we were doing core modeling, we put that as a very priority, like for everyone to share their codes and things like that in GitHub, but also like their production runs. So even like doing version control and what's being generated and getting all those input data and that decisions made during the different course of the model run to be publicly available. And also we did a lot of these webinars and things like that, so that people can get more information and know who the contact person is if they need it.
Yeah, so maybe, and that's a great question, so maybe for the synthesis, we'll think about how we want to make sure that people have access to the codes and the legacies, right? They're all there, but sometimes they're a bit tricky to find, so that's a good suggestion for us. Andrew, did you have one last question?
Yeah, quick one for Pravin, perhaps, about your interesting stuff you're doing about translating research into practice. So in the universities, we're getting pretty good at pushing people to use version control and different programming languages and upskilling them in that way. But in industry and in government, I think things are a bit different. So how can we help government and industry, I guess, to use the tools that we're using that become really so essential to things like reproducible workflows?
So it will be the same things that I mentioned before in my slides, right? So like involving from the beginning and seeing that what the actual problem that they have, like then making solutions based on that one, right? So and involving them from the beginning of the project, so that when you generate the knowledge, it's co-produced by everyone, and making sure that all the tools are publicly available tools. So because sometimes I've been in situations where some programs are generated by MATLAB or things like that, and then when I don't have access to that, I cannot even verify if the code runs properly. And using that in my daily life is a different question, right? Because things like that, so using public source codes, and also I think another big issue is the training, right? So sometimes it's like you'll have these codes available, but then you don't really have a good idea of how to use them. So if you're giving some webinars and things like that, And another thing I know, Andrew, you also do is this internships with the CREATE program that use, not the CREATE, with the water security program that use any students for internship. That I think is very valuable, because we have been able to generate more research projects out of those internships. That the results have helped us in making some of the decisions and knowing, like designing some research program on our own. So everything is, I think it helps. I think the main thing is the communication. So if you find a way to stay in touch and understand the issues and things like that, then other solutions will come out of that communication that you have with the different stakeholders.
Yeah. I think part of it too, Andrew, will be training, right? So, we're training our new students coming in and get them involved with using these open sources, in their first and second and third year in engineering or in hydrology or wherever they're sitting, will really help, because then they'll take that into industry when they move on, right? And so I think it's a bit of a paradigm shift we're seeing now, and it'll continue in the future. And just a shout out to Manitoba Hydro here. I remember working with them 15 years ago. They funded the initial Kappa efforts for Canada, right? So they were the ones that came to the table and started Kappa, and I know a lot of people use Kappa now and all the provinces use it, right? But it was actually Manitoba Hydro that engaged with ECCC and funded the first postdoc on Kappa. So there's been a long history of industry engagement with research. So, okay, well, I think we're good. So Chris, maybe you want to direct people to the next thing, or do you want me to, or? Okay, so apparently the buses are down out the main doors to the left, and so those buses will take you to Wanuskewin. It's not very far, and we'll see everybody there. So thank you.